Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 251. The Golden Group. Far away in the north, a baby boy named Brandon Stark was born. There was also the increasingly fierce conflict between the Night's Watch and the wildlings near the wall. The war that was about to break out could not affect the scenery on the other side of the narrow sea. Crash, the waves still beat on the rocks, and the cold wind howled from the sea. It had been a few days since Viserys returned from Andalus. What happened a few days ago was just a false alarm. When His Majesty disappeared on the first day, no one took it seriously. After all, there was a dragon by his side. However, Viserys had not returned on the second day, so they became a little worried. Jon sent soldiers out of the city to search everywhere, and also met with the tattered prince, hoping that the brothers of the Windblown could also go together to find the whereabouts of His Majesty. The tattered prince was hesitant at first, but when he saw Jon was about to draw his sword, he finally agreed. However, after a whole day of searching the next day, Viserys' whereabouts were still not found. Just when the various forces in the city of Pentos were slightly active. Late that night, Viserys rode a dragon down from the sky and returned to Pentos. With the young king riding a dragon again, all the restless voices and thoughts disappeared. Viserys returned to Pentos in a high-profile manner, holding Maester Aemon's letter for help, but did not ask for advice from his staff. He just kept it for the time being, and decided to wait quietly for news from the other side of the narrow sea. Then, a few days passed. Viserys was handling some official business, and Jon Connington suddenly came to his room and brought Viserys another unexpected news. The Golden Group. On the top floor of the Nine-Tower Palace in Pentos, the sea breeze blew in along the windowsill. The young man with loose silver hair was slightly stunned when he heard Jon's words, then put down the pen in his hand and raised his head. Yes, Jon Connington, who was sitting opposite him, put his hands on his knees and spoke seriously. The current leader of the Golden Company, Maester the Black, has asked me to convey his request to you. Maester first contacted Illyrio, then Jon, and then asked Jon to convey this intention to Viserys. He is still in Lies, leading the Golden Company to fulfill the contract with Lies, but he sent a confidant to bring a message that he hopes to come to Pentos one day to meet the true heir to the Iron Throne, the true dragon. Viserys heard Jon Connington repeat what he just said and confirmed that he had not heard it wrong. Oh, the leader of the Golden Company sent someone to come and see him. This is a bit interesting. Viserys stroked his chin slightly and leaned back on the back of the chair. He did not speak at the first time, but just pondered for a moment and then spoke. As far as I know, Jon, the Golden Company was founded by the noble bastard son of King of the Menegan IV. The first leader of the Golden Company was Frost Iron Rivers. Perhaps others are not familiar with this name, but Viserys knows it very well. You can see it in the family history of the Targaryen family or the history of the Seven Kingdoms. In the 196th year of the Aegon calendar, Daemon Blackfyre and his followers launched the first Blackfyre Rebellion. As the illegitimate son legalized by Aegon IV, Cold Iron Rivers also participated in the Blackfyre Rebellion. He joined Daemon Blackfyre's side and wanted to challenge the orthodox survival of the Targaryen family. Later, after the rebellion was suppressed, he fled to Essos and established the Golden Company. Until now, the Golden Company is full of descendants of knights and lords who once participated in the Blackfyre Rebellion and lost their titles and fiefs. And the current leader of the Golden Company, Maester, suddenly wanted to visit Viserys, which is intriguing enough. Of course I know the background of the Golden Company, Your Majesty. Jon Connington took a deep breath, nodded and said. He once became the right hand of Maester in the Golden Company, which was equivalent to the position of deputy leader. Later, it was because of Viserys that he left the Golden Company and came to Pentos. But, however, Jon Connington was a little hesitant to say this, and then he considered his words and continued. The Golden Company has been making a living in the disputed land since its establishment, employed by the Lies Autoroshi, and carried out endless harassment wars for them. But in fact, they have always dreamed of regaining the homeland of their ancestors. They are the descendants of exiles, with nothing and never forgiven, but at the same time they are a powerful armed force. John Connington was silent again and then spoke. Now the nobles in Westeros have also betrayed the Targaryens. The Golden Company may want to help His Majesty regain the Iron Throne, to wash away their sins. At the same time, they hope to be forgiven by His Majesty and return to the homeland of their fathers. John Connington suggested that Viserys should not directly refuse the request of the Golden Company. Although he wanted to say that the Red Dragon and the Black Dragon were still one family, he finally stopped talking. Because the Red Dragon was a dragon, while the Black Dragon was a dragon that was not recognized by the Targaryen family. Although they had the same blood, it would ultimately depend on how Viserys decided. Viserys thought about it for a moment, but he neither agreed nor refuted Jon's point of view. The grey red-haired man secretly observed the expression on Viserys' face, but unfortunately he didn't see anything. Then Viserys nodded and suddenly spoke. Okay. In that case, it doesn't hurt to meet. John Connington was not too surprised that Viserys suddenly agreed. Although Targaryen and Blackfyre were sworn enemies, because of several Blackfyre rebellions, they were from the same root and had the same blood. Red or black, a dragon is a dragon. John Connington suddenly thought of this sentence. Moreover, the Golden Company has tens of thousands of elite warriors, 500 cavalry, 500 squire riders, and 1,000 archers, and even has terrifying war weapons such as elephants. Then John Connington stayed in Viserys' room for a while longer. After chatting for a few words, John stopped disturbing Viserys and stood up to say goodbye. However, not long after John Connington left, there was another knock on the door. Viserys' room was particularly lively today. Then the girl from Dawn, Irian Martell, pushed the door open and walked in. Viserys. The girl walked in wearing a simple sand-colored long dress, wrapped in a seductive fragrance. She sat on the armrest of Viserys' chair very familiarly, then leaned over and kissed him gently on the side of his face. Chapter 252 Lover. Irian kissed him gently on the side of his face, opened her bright eyes, and looked at him closely, then parted her red lips and whispered softly, "My love." Russell. Viserys sat on the chair, the tip of the pen slid across the paper, and wrote the last word. Then he put the pen down and looked up at the beauty sitting beside him. Irian. Viserys reached out and hugged the girl's slender waist, then pulled her into his arms. Irian only let out a slight exclamation, then fell into Viserys' arms. The flames burning in the fireplace in the room were not as hot as the beauty in his arms now. Viserys held Irian in his arms and looked down at each other's cheeks, and the Dornish girl also looked at him closely with a pair of dark eyes. The boy's silver gold hair fell on her plump chest, and his lavender eyes sparkled. Then he lowered his head and kissed her deeply. The girl in his arms uttered a whimper, as if she had fallen into a quagmire, and then completely sank into it. After a while, he let go of her with a slight gasp, his eyes full of admiration. After a few months of getting along, the relationship between Irian and Viserys naturally developed into a couple. Viserys needed Dawn, just as he also needed the Golden Company. "My love, when can I meet Rhaenys and little Dany?" Irian fell into Viserys' arms, hooked her arms around his neck, looked into his eyes and asked. She couldn't wait to meet Viserys' family. She knew that Viserys had a sister and a niece. Rhaenys Targaryen was her aunt's daughter, and was considered her sister. She knew the rules of the Targaryen family. Viserys couldn't have only her as a woman, and he had to ensure the purity of the Targaryen family's bloodline. However, Irian didn't care about it. That was the custom in Dawn. Keeping mistresses and illegitimate children was nothing there. Irian and Dawn only wanted the title of Targaryen queen. Therefore, she wanted to establish a good relationship with her cousin Rhaenys in advance, so that she would have a helper in the future. After all, Rhaenys also had Dawn blood flowing in her body. Soon. However, Viserys raised his eyebrows slightly when he heard Irian's question. He looked at the expression on the girl's face, and then he didn't know what he was thinking about. He hesitated for a moment and nodded. "I will take Rhaenys and Dany over." "Really? That's great." The Dawn girl stretched slightly in Viserys' arms, and then sat up from his arms. The red lips kissed his cheek again, and then stood up, with her slender hands still on his shoulders. I'm going to go out of the city with the Sand Snake Sisters this afternoon. Do you want to go with us? Where to? Viserys asked curiously while sitting on the chair. Sunrise Gate. The largest gate in Pentos is called the Sunrise Gate. Once, Cal Balboa died unexpectedly, and his Cals fought fiercely outside the city of Pentos, just outside the Sunrise Gate. Drogo obtained the position of a Cal through fierce fighting, and wanted to bring people to find trouble with Viserys, but Viserys was not at the Sunrise Gate at that time, so Drogo's attack was empty. Oh. Viserys thought about it for a while, and then nodded. Okay. He was going to do something there this afternoon. The Red Temple was near the Sunrise Gate, and Melisandre had made an appointment with him in advance. Soon it was afternoon. Viserys rode his white warhorse, and the white mare he used to ride was given to Irian. I'll go first, dear. Irian kissed Viserys on the side of his face. Viserys nodded slightly, and then the girl urged the white horse to go not far away, where the Sand Snake Sisters had been waiting for her for a long time. They were going to go hunting today. The girls in Dawn were different from the women in other places in the Seven Kingdoms. Because of their relatively equal status, girls also had the right to inherit. Therefore, girls could also choose to wield swords and guns instead of sitting in front of the dressing table and being a lady. The Sand Snake Sisters, like their father, were all masters of fighting and proficient in poisons. Irian herself could ride a horse and was quite skilled. Therefore, the girls' only hobby in Pentos was to go hunting. However, even though they liked adventure, Viserys still sent a team of guards to protect them to prevent any accidents. After all, Irian's position was very important. The young king with a golden crown on his head sat on the horse, and the golden sunlight shone down and reflected the light. Viserys watched the Dawn girls and their guards go away, and then slowly retracted his gaze. At this time, the red-robed witch riding a black horse urged the horse, replaced Tyrion's position after she left, and came to Viserys' side. The breeze blew Melisandre's copper-red hair, and then she turned her head and spoke. Princess Irian Martell is of noble status, and she is one of the best candidates to become queen. But she is not destined to be queen. Viserys had just retracted his gaze, and when he heard Melisandre's words, he turned his head slightly and looked at her. Melisandre looked straight at Viserys' eyes, and then lowered her head after a few seconds, as if she was uncomfortable. Why do you say that? Viserys was silent for a while, and once again looked up at Irian's back as she left in the distance. The cold wind blew his hair, and then he looked at Melisandre again and asked, "Are you looking at the face or the palm? Have you learned to tell fortunes now?" He did not believe in fate, because his fate had changed a long time ago. If it was really according to fate, he should still be transferred to foster care in the major powerful families in Pentos with his sister. But now those powerful families in Pentos have been eliminated by him, and he has become the master of Pentos. I don't know. However, when the Red Witch faced Viserys' question, she paused slightly and shook her head. She didn't understand what Viserys meant by face reading, palm reading and fortune telling. But she seemed to be able to understand the general principles, based on the vocabulary. I'm just following the instructions of the Lord of Light. Melisandre hesitated and said. Chapter 253 Deer Hunting. However, Viserys shook his head slightly after hearing what the Red Witch said, and couldn't help but sneered. You said that the Lord of Light is the true God. Then he pulled the reins, turned his horse's head and walked back, while continuing to speak. And the true God has so many believers, how can he have time to care who my woman is? This. Melisandre was speechless for a moment, and opened her mouth, not knowing how to start. But she also turned her horse's head, and followed behind Viserys, walking down the hillside. Go. Viserys rode in front, turned his head to look at Melisandre, and then said, I'm not afraid to tell you. I received a letter from my great uncle, and the figure of the White Walker has appeared on the wall. Viserys followed Melisandre today, to deal with some religious matters. If you want to truly win the Seven Kingdoms and rule for a long time, you need to get the support of the believers of the Seven Gods. This was known to the Targaryen family when his ancestor Aegon I conquered Westeros. In Pentos, if you want to gain widespread support in this land, you must rely on the local church. The followers of the Red God are developing rapidly on the continent of Essos, sweeping across some cities without mainstream sects, and even some city-states with local gods have been invaded by the followers of the Red God. For example, Old Town, Koha, etc. Following behind Viserys, Melisandre was still frowning and thinking about the question just raised by the other party, thinking about how to answer it. However, after thinking about it, Melisandre herself was confused. She even couldn't tell whether she had received a warning from the Lord of Light, or whether she didn't think Irian was a suitable candidate in her heart. So she used the name of the Lord of Light to subconsciously warn Viserys. Because it originated from the bottom of her heart, she didn't see the answer from the flame. It was just a whim, and then she couldn't help but speak. But she didn't expect to be directly exposed by Viserys, so she was a little speechless. However, at this moment, she heard Viserys' casual words. HMM. The Red Witch raised her head slightly, startled for a moment, and did not react to what Viserys was saying at first. Then she heard Viserys repeat it again, and her face changed slightly. White Walkers? Do you mean that there are traces of White Walkers on the wall? It was afternoon. The sun was still shining brightly, shining on the woman's white chest. A gorgeous necklace, with a red gem in the middle, reflected the light slightly. Melisandre spoke in a hurried tone. Your Majesty, can you let me see the letter? Night fell quickly. The sky was completely dark, and every household in the rich city-state of Pentos began to light up. And the girls who went out hunting finally returned with the prey they hunted today. Although it is winter now, many creatures that have hibernated have reduced their range of activities, but the girls still made a worthwhile trip. Abera, the eldest sister of the sand snakes, was slightly injured. She was slapped when she and her sisters were hunting a brown bear. Then the soldiers who were protecting the sisters rushed forward and killed the poor brown bear that hibernated and came out to find something to eat. Abera was injured, probably because her ribs were broken. After being corrected by the doctor in the palace, it should be fine. This time, the 4 girls hunted a brown bear and a stag together. In fact, the soldiers worked harder than the girls. For example, Irian was very smart and just shot arrows from behind and didn't run over like Abera. Therefore, after Irian came back, she had some energy left. She wanted to cook a dish with the taste of her hometown for her lover. This was the reserved program that the two agreed to before they parted during the day, and Viserys had been looking forward to it for a long time. Then the soldiers carried the stag into the kitchen. Irian rolled up her sleeves, picked up a short knife given to her by her father, and then began to dissect the stag. The stag was a small show effect that Irian had prepared long ago because it could be meaningful, and she thought Viserys would definitely like it. However, Irian's dagger didn't seem to be very sharp, and it was a bit difficult to dissect the stag. Then Viserys took out a dagger from his arms and gave it to her. This was the weapon left by the faceless man who assassinated Viserys. There were 2 daggers in total, which should be a set of weapons. The first one was abandoned in the palace during the assassination, and the second one was found on the body of the faceless man who was killed by Viserys when he fell into the trap. Both daggers were made of Valyrian steel. Is this Valyrian steel? Irian was surprised and happy to see the dagger. Although it was just 2 daggers, they didn't weigh much, and they couldn't even be made into a sword after melting, but they were still very precious. My love, are you really willing to give it to me? Irian looked very happy and kissed Viserys on the face again. Then the dinner went very smoothly, and everyone in the palace participated. Viserys also tasted the dill egg roasted by Irian, which was sprinkled with a special spice, and it was indeed very Dornish. There were also bear paws that had been slow cooked for a long time, which were very rich in collagen, and the skin, flesh, and bones were loose. During the banquet, the Red Witch frequently looked up at Viserys, looking a little uneasy. She had seen the letter of help from Aemon Targaryen during the day, and learned about the resurrection of the White Walkers. Perhaps it would not be long before the news of the coalition army going north to support the North would reach Pentos. Soon after, the banquet ended. Viserys was about to leave, and Melisandre came to Viserys and said, "Your Majesty, can we talk?" Melisandre looked at Viserys with a sharp look in her eyes, and Irian also came over on the other side. Viserys looked at Melisandre, looked at the dark sky outside, and then shook his head and said, "Tomorrow." He knew what the Red Witch wanted to talk to him about. Melisandre nodded. She also knew that there was no way to rush this matter. Then the Red Witch nodded and smiled politely at Irian, who was walking over, and then passed by her. Irian also smiled politely, stretched out her hand, and took Vizira's arm. She turned her head and looked at Melisandre's back as she left. Then she followed Viserys to his bedroom. Chapter 254 Wait and See. The next morning, the bright sunlight penetrated the windowsill and sprinkled into this elegant bedroom. The candles on the bedside had long been extinguished, and the exquisite light-colored curtains were blown by the wind. A soft bed that could accommodate 3 or 4 adults was placed in the center of the room, with golden curtains hanging down. On the wall above the bed was a 3-headed dragon emblem. The sun had risen now. Viserys was sitting by the bed, buttoning up his clothes one by one, feeling refreshed and even clearer in his mind. Sure enough, you can't suppress your desires too much. It's human instinct. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. Viserys shook his head. The olive-skinned Dornish girl was still sleeping soundly on the soft bed. After a night of tossing and turning, Irian was also a little exhausted, and she didn't even notice how indecent her sleeping posture was. Viserys turned his head and looked at Irian, who was still sleeping soundly. The girl's legs were wrapped around the quilt, just like she had been with Viserys yesterday, revealing half of her plump breasts. She was sleeping very soundly. Seeing this, Viserys shook his head slightly and then tidied the quilt for Irian. Then he leaned over and kissed her forehead gently. During the kiss, Viserys' silver gold hair fell on the girl's cheek, which seemed to affect Irian, who was sleeping, and made her nose sniff slightly. Have a good rest, Irian. Then Viserys stood up, picked up the coat from the chair, and put it on, and strode out of the room. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. The servants passing by in the corridor of the palace saw Viserys, and hurriedly bowed slightly. In the bedroom, as soon as Viserys walked out of the room, Irian slowly opened her eyes. Then she raised her hand and gently touched the place where her lover had kissed her just now. Irian had actually woken up when Viserys was getting dressed, but the girl's thoughts moved slightly, wanting to see what kind of attitude Viserys would have towards her behind her back. Then a satisfied smile appeared on her face, and her delicate body wrapped in a soft quilt curled up together. Soon, another half a month passed quickly. News about Westeros gradually reached Pentos. However, these news only showed that wildlings had broken out in the bitter cold land north of the wall. Viserys sat in his study and looked at the intelligence in his hand and fell into deep thought. The king beyond the wall organized hundreds of tribes, adding up to hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, from the elderly to children, marching towards the wall in a mighty manner, preparing to attack the 7 kingdoms. And the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first men, King Robert Baratheon I, the protector of Westeros, personally led the coalition forces of the deer, fish, eagle, lion, and rose families to the north. To help the north resist the challenge of the wildlings, even the Dornish symbolically send out an army to respond to the king's call. This is the apparent reason. The nobles are still keeping the news of the resurrection of the White Walker strictly confidential, and they are not leaked out for fear of causing panic and causing irreversible consequences. And Viserys has been closely following the development of events in Westeros since he received a letter from Maester Aemon. Now it seems that before the White Walkers really come, Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, will have a head-on battle with the king of the 7 kingdoms at the wall. But about the outcome of this battle, Viserys feels there is no suspense. Although the Free People's Kingdom claims to have hundreds of thousands of wildlings, Viserys knows that there is a lot of water in it, because all the wildlings are soldiers, and men, women, and children are mixed in with their families. And the weapons and equipment of the wildlings are extremely scarce. Even most of these hundreds of thousands of wildlings can only use weapons such as wooden sticks and stone axes, not to mention armor. Only a few middle-aged male wildlings may get a helmet or a wrist guard or other protective gear. Their organization and command were in disarray, and they had not undergone any training. They could only rely on their bravery. It was difficult for them to defeat the Night's Watch, which had less than 1,000 people, let alone Robert Baratheon I, who had assembled the army of the 7 kingdoms. If Robert was defeated by the wildlings, he would not even have to return to King's Landing, and could just commit suicide on the way. Viserys was thinking about another problem. It seems that among the commanders of the coalition this time, Eddard Stark, Jair Mormont, and Robert Baratheon. Viserys heard that the Duke of Dragonstone, Stannis, was also free and wanted to go to the wall together. These people are not like Jon Snow. They should not let the wildlings enter the wall. The wildlings outside the wall were lawless and unwilling to submit to the royal power. They did not produce anything and lived by burning, killing, and looting. If they were allowed to enter the wall, it would inevitably cause a great impact on the stable order of the Seven Kingdoms, and even cause trouble for 1,000 years. And if we don't let these wildlings enter the wall, then when the White Walkers really come, they will become hundreds of thousands of dead army. Viserys sat at the table, the breeze blowing the window screen. The bright sunshine outside the window was warm. He was interested in thinking that this time the Night King's army might be stronger than the original trajectory. But correspondingly, the strength of the human coalition is also stronger than the original trajectory. This is a Seven Kingdom that has not yet been divided. King Robert, who was once brave and good at fighting on horseback and took the Iron Throne, has not died yet. Famous commanders including Eddard Stark and Stannis gathered together. Will the dead army win this time, or will humans defeat evil and drive the White Walkers back to the land of eternal winter? Viserys hopes to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight, quietly waiting for things to change, to see if it will be as he expected. After all, he is still on the other side of the narrow sea, and the Iron Throne has changed hands. It is no longer the Targaryen family that sits firmly on the throne. Whoever sits on the throne will take responsibility. Now that the Baratheon family has joined forces with the wolf, fish, eagle and lion families to seize the Iron Throne, no one can say that saving the Seven Kingdoms and all mankind is his duty and responsibility. Viserys can watch with peace of mind, without any psychological burden. And can the army of the dead swim? However, having said that, Viserys does not want a Westeros where humans are extinct. Although it sounds like a joke now. But if Westeros is really occupied by the army of the dead, the cold wind of the land of eternal winter will even blow to dawn. At that time, who knows whether these uncontrollable army of the dead can swim across the narrow sea. And at this time, bang, the door of Viserys' study was pushed open, and a figure hurried in. Your Majesty, urgent information. Chapter 255, Abandoned. The person who came was Jon Connington. Illyrio had been away from Pentos for a long time. Based on the rise of Targaryen and the almost inevitable conflict with Braavos, they have already shown a posture of falling out. As the boss of the Free Trade Castle, Braavos naturally wants to suppress the aggressive challenger like Targaryen, in order to maintain its position. Therefore, after careful consideration, Viserys sent Illyrio, who had away, and had been to the distant slave bay Astapor to buy the Unsullied. Viserys had seen the figure of the Unsullied in Illyrio's mansion last time, and on the bloody night, Jon Connington led a dozen Unsullied disguised as the Pentos garrison and suddenly drew his sword. At that time, he was fascinated by this elite division. The Unsullied can absolutely obey the orders of the master and are fearless. They are exactly the elite soldiers that Viserys needs now. In the future, whether it is facing the pressure of Braavos or opening up other territories, or even invading Westeros, the Unsullied will have ample room to play. And do the Unsullied have any shortcomings? Yes. The only shortcoming of the Unsullied is that they are expensive, but expensive things often have only one shortcoming, and this is most likely not his shortcoming, but your shortcoming. And Viserys is particularly generous in this regard. Is he rich? Viserys is very rich now. The governors of Pentos who robbed them, not counting the rewards they distributed. The remaining money is enough to dazzle Viserys, who has seen the wealth left by the Targaryen family. These governors lie on the people of Pentos and suck their bones and marrow, and the money they make is simply unimaginable. Therefore, Viserys can be so generous, and let Illyrio take the money and set off with a wave of his hand, showing great trust, and not worrying that Illyrio will take the opportunity to run away with the money. As for Astapor, as long as you take the money, you don't have to worry about them not shipping the goods after receiving the money. Although the good masters of Slavers Bay have long been morally corrupt, they are very trustworthy in doing business. They deeply understand the importance of credit in doing business. Now, Viserys sent Illyrio out to buy the Unsullied to expand the army, and Jon Connington became the only person he could trust. So Jon, who was very idle before, began to be busy, running around, and handling all matters conscientiously. In fact, Jon Connington's voice in Pentos is even greater than that of the tattered prince, who is now the Prince of Pentos. The tattered prince once dreamed of returning to his hometown and taking control of power, but when he really sat in this position, the tattered prince found that he seemed to have been fooled. Viserys seemed to be sitting in Pentus and was not going to move, and he could not and did not have the courage to drive Viserys away. So Viserys stayed in the Nine Towers Palace without leaving the door, and all the power in Pentus was under his control. The tattered prince was like a balloon, floating in the air. He seemed to have great power, but his real power had long been hollowed out. Even the brothers who were once in the Windblown, who have now transformed themselves into the garrison, have begun to change their positions. They used to work under a leader, but now they suddenly find that there is a bigger leader above the leader. Now you have a chance to work under a bigger leader. Will you go? Yes. So many brothers who were once in the Windblown gradually changed their positions under Ramsay's secret coercion, inducement and other methods. They began to perfunctorily deal with the orders of the tattered prince and learned to play it off in an official manner. Even the tattered prince's most trusted right-hand man, the war poet Denzo Dehan and the Dothraki cargo, began to waver, and their eyes gradually became a little wrong when they looked at the tattered prince. We used to live a good life when we suffered together. Why did I lead the brothers to change their fate? But it turned out like this. The tattered prince was puzzled. Perhaps he also understood the reason, but he was unwilling to face this reality. People's Hearts article. The tattered prince could only sigh. Following a young and vigorous lord with more power and a future is definitely more promising than following an old and sidelined person. John Connington wanted the tattered prince to order a search for Viserys not long ago. At that time, the tattered prince was still a little hesitant, and John even drew his sword. However, he didn't expect that before he opened his mouth, a large number of brothers who had once been members of the Windblown were called away by John. Then he hurriedly added orders to prevent anyone from seeing any clues. But now, John Connington's hurried arrival did not bring good news to Viserys. The Dothraki are coming to attack Pentus. Viserys sat at the desk and put down the intelligence in his hand, raised his head, and looked at John, frowning slightly. Where did you get the news from? The man with long grey red hair sitting opposite Viserys explained, and Viserys couldn't help frowning again after hearing it. You mean the Dothraki are raising the banner to avenge their friends, the governors of Pentus? So that's why they want to attack Pentus? Dothraki actually have friends? Viserys shook his head at this lame excuse and couldn't help but want to laugh. The Dothraki might as well just say that they want to take the opportunity to plunder this rich pearl of the bay so that everyone would be more used to it. Since the bloody century, the Dothraki have appeared on the world stage as a barbarian. Until now, this people on the grasslands have destroyed countless cities and exterminated countless races. Now the Dothraki have united 5 khals and nearly 80,000 cavalry warriors, a scale comparable to the Battle of Ravenfield that destroyed the kingdom of Sana. You really think highly of me? You really never stop for a moment. Viserys sighed. He had originally thought of sitting on the mountain and watching the fight between the 7 kingdoms and the wildlings in Westeros, and the war between the White Walkers and humans. That would happen later. However, God didn't want him to be idle for too long, so he sent him another enemy, so that he had no chance to be lazy. Viserys shook his head slightly, but strangely, he didn't feel too nervous in his heart. Maybe he was used to the tense life. From King's Landing to Dragonstone, Andalus and Pentus, Viserys had significant changes at every step, and now he will wait for the challenge of the Dothraki in Pentus. Chapter 256. The war is coming. Then Viserys thought for a moment, and then spoke. John, keep this secret. Then tell the tattered prince and those families to send people and money. Viserys said. The governor's family of Pentus was slaughtered, but some wealthy merchant families who escaped came back trembling when they saw that there was no follow-up. After all, their assets, businesses, and ancestral foundations are here, which cannot be easily transferred in a short time. So Viserys is not afraid that they will escape again after knowing the news. However, at this time, all of them were used by Viserys, because Viserys believed that they all knew that if Pentus was really captured by the Dothraki, it would be a real disaster. I'm afraid that something 100 times more terrifying than the Bloody Night will happen, and it is not impossible that the city-state of Pentus will become history. Understood. And John Connington nodded slightly. He had personally commanded a war before, and although the final result of the Battle of the Bells was the defeat of the Royal Army, the reasons were very complicated, and it could not be denied that John Connington was an excellent commander, even if it was not a crime of war. In the end, King Era's II deprived John of his title and expelled him, which indirectly led to the tragic end of the fall of King's Landing. And the next moment, to resist the aggressive Dothraki, was the moment for John to prove himself again. Now, when he thought of these men with long grey red hair, he couldn't help but get excited. He was waiting for such an opportunity. Since he was expelled from King's Landing by the king, he could only mingle with mercenary groups such as the Golden Group when he wandered in Essos. Although John relied on his excellent ability to command several battles and won victories, he finally climbed to the position of the right hand of the leader, Mise Toyne. However, John was still not satisfied with this. It is easy to go from frugality to luxury, but it is difficult to go from luxury to frugality. After all, John Connington once became the Earl of Griffin's Roost and the Hand of the King when he was only a few years older than Viserys now. Now he has fallen to the commander of a mercenary group. How can he be willing? Therefore, he brought Egon, the son of Rhaegar, to Viserys, one to fulfill his honor and loyalty to return the prince, and the other to get a chance to prove himself again. He was a loser, but he was unwilling to fail. He was not old yet, he was still in his prime. And Viserys seemed to be able to see the flames gradually burning in his heart from the face of the king's hand, who was once his father. He narrowed his eyes slightly and then spoke. In that case, John, you are my most reliable right-hand man in Pentos, and I will need you to contribute more in the next war. Viserys saw the burning ambition in John's heart. Everyone has his own ambitions, but everyone pursues something different. Just as the tattered prince hopes to monopolize power, Egon hopes to be recognized by his uncle, and John is eager for honor and fame. Even power is placed second to him, and money is not worth mentioning. Some people love power, some are lustful, and others hope to get honor. Although Viserys looks only 16 years old, his ability to read people's minds far exceeds his apparent age, so he arranges a suitable position for John. As the king and the core of the Targaryen forces, Viserys does not just need to pretend, pick up girls, and squander money every day. A king who spends his time appreciating flowers and drinking wine every day cannot support a huge empire. Especially as a founding king, Viserys' goal is almost to rebuild an empire. On the contrary, he needs to consider many things, all aspects of the matter, and he doesn't think there is anything wrong with reading his subordinates' minds. After all, no one owes him anything, and John is the same. Fully grasp the thoughts and demands of each subordinate, so that everyone can be united together to become an indestructible team and force. This is the experience that Viserys has summed up from his previous position, and he has used it now, making him a king who is somewhat courteous and different in the eyes of others. Sure enough, when Viserys finished speaking, Jon's heart beat violently, and then he raised his head and looked at Viserys. Although Jon had experienced several ups and downs in his life, his heart had long become as hard as iron. But it must be said that Viserys' words were just right, and they still touched the only soft spot in his heart. There were both emotions of being moved and melancholy. Jon thought of the past 8 or 9 years ago, and finally sighed. Your Majesty, your brother was once a person like you. Then the man stood up, with some true feelings and some acting, and put one hand on his chest and hit it hard. Then he knelt on one knee. I'm willing to stop the 80,000 Dothraki army for your Majesty. Soon. Another 2 months passed quickly. 80,000 Dothraki riders were marching towards the western world, and there was no way to stop such a movement. Although Viserys had received the news a long time ago and strictly blocked the spread, the news gradually spread and became a sensation. People fled Pentos to find other ways out, and some people who could not leave Pentos were also panicked, not knowing what the future would be like, and whether Viserys could defend Pentos. The Targaryen family's army had also been actively preparing for war long ago. John Connington worked hard and gave full play to his command and dispatch ability as the king's hand. Orders were issued one after another from his hands. Collecting food and grass, stockpiling kerosene, building weapons and equipment for city defense weapons, rolling logs and stones, strengthening the city walls, and temporarily hiring a large number of mercenaries and wandering knights. The number of Pentos city garrisons doubled. and in the distant Jidoha. Now the newly built Angelhood Castle is stationed in the 1st Legion, and intelligence is delivered to Pentus like snowflakes every day. Angelhood Castle was built on the ruins of Jidoha. Built near the river and mountains, it blocked all possibilities of invading the Ants plain from the southeast. The geographical location is extremely important, and it is a transportation hub for water and land, and it is easy to defend, and difficult to attack. The Roina chose to build a city here for this reason. Now, 5 Cals and 80,000 Dothraki have joined forces, and the front line has appeared in the 1st Legion's control area. More than 10,000 Andal soldiers of the 1st Legion, under the command of Legion Commander Bessie, have shrunk their defenses and retreated to a dangerous pass that is easy to defend, but difficult to attack. The dark clouds of war gradually envelop this land. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 257 Pre-War Meeting. According to the intelligence from the commander, a part of the Dothraki vanguard has arrived at the foot of Hellfire. John Connington was dressed in military uniform, and the bright armor reflected the light of the candle. The room was brightly lit. Viserys was also dressed in neat military uniform. On both sides, there were 2 rows of main commanders of the Pentus garrison, including the Tattered Prince. A huge map was covered on the long command table, and everyone could see it. The map covered the golden fields in the south and Andalus and Norvus in the north, including Pentus. The Great Plain between Pentus and me was the focus of this map, and it was marked with many marks. At the same time, as a sand table simulation, there were also wooden sculptures of dragons representing the Targaryen army and 5 wooden sculptures of ponies symbolizing the Horse King. As for the main force of the Dothraki is here. Then John Connington held a baton in his hand and pointed to the mountain in the Great Plain. This is the only mountain in the vast plain. The Dothraki split up. Perhaps because the 5 Cals did not have a unified command, or because they were confident in their own strength. The 80,000 Dothraki were almost twice the strength of the Targaryen family, if we count the villages and towns that were breached along the way, and the slaves that were plundered and captured to serve as cannon fodder. The number of the Dothraki army has exceeded 100,000. Among them, 2 Cals, Kaljiko and Kalmoro, led their respective Cals to join together. 30,000 Dothraki warriors drove the slaves away from the main force on the Great Plains and headed straight to the intersection of the Sancha River. There was the 1st Legion of the Targaryen family stationed there, with a number of up to 10,000 people. The other main force of the Dothraki was led by the elderly Kalmoza and Kaljako and Kalpono, who had some grudges before but now joined forces. The main force of 50,000 Dothraki warriors drove the slaves and headed straight towards Pentus. Lord Connington, there is one thing I don't understand. Don't these Dothraki know that they can exert their greatest power only when their fists are clenched? In the meeting room of the Nine Towers Palace, the former captain of the Windblown, the war poet Denzo Dehan, asked with some confusion. Although he used to be able to command the mercenary group in battle, he acted steadily and achieved remarkable success. However, now he is asked to participate in the command of an epic war with more than 100,000 people on both sides and the battlefield depth reaching hundreds of kilometers. His ability is still a little stretched, and even his brain is a little confused. And this phenomenon is not only reflected in Denzo Dehan. Except for Viserys and John Connington, who are still calm, everyone is staring at each other, and even the Tattered Prince is a little confused. Viserys once followed Maester Daniel to learn the knowledge of war in books. Later, he followed Sir Geoffrey, the commander-in-chief of the Dragonstone fleet, to observe and learn the application of actual combat, and later personally commanded a war with more than 10,000 people. Viserys was a professional who had achieved brilliant results in actual combat. John Connington was in much the same situation as Viserys. He was well educated and had experience in commanding a war of 10,000 people. Therefore, the two of them remained calm in the face of up to 80,000 Dothraki and tens of thousands of refugees, a total of more than 100,000 enemies. but the tattered prince, who had only commanded more than 2,000 people in the Windblown, and his mercenary commanders were far behind, both in courage and brains. Denzo Dehan didn't understand why the Dothraki had to divide their forces. The other commanders of the Pentus garrison present also nodded in unison. They also had such doubts in their hearts. Facing an enemy twice their number, they didn't make a fool of themselves on the surface, but they kept backing down in their hearts, because they want to cut off the connection between the First Legion and Pentus. At this time, Viserys, who was sitting in the main seat and looking at the sand table simulation on the map, spoke abruptly. He pinched his eyebrows slightly with one hand. Many people say that the Dothraki are stupid, but are all Dothraki stupid? He doesn't believe this. A long time ago, Drogo died in his hands because he underestimated the enemy and set a fire to burn him to death. However, the bravery and fearlessness of the Dothraki still left a very deep impression on Viserys. This group of Dothraki roaring warriors are simply natural cavalry. There are almost no races that can match their mastery of horses and cavalry strategies and tactics. However, the only shortcoming of the Dothraki is also their advantage. That is, they rely too much on riding horses, so that they are willing to give up armor and infantry. If the Dothraki are willing to wear helmets and armor, and combine infantry and cavalry to build siege weapons, coupled with their admiration for bravery and fearlessness, the entire Essos continent will surrender to them. At that time, Viserys even envied these Dothraki cavalry. However, after defeating Drogo, he captured some Dothraki, but they were unwilling to surrender to Viserys, and would rather be sold as slaves. Perhaps they still believed that Viserys had relied on despicable blood magic to defeat Khal Drogo, the greatest horseman in the world. Viserys still had some regrets at that time. Cut off the connection? Hearing the king's words, all the commanders of the Pentus garrison in the conference hall couldn't help but whisper. Jon, who was still standing in front of the map, turned his head and looked at Viserys. The two looked at each other and nodded. Your Majesty is right. The Dothraki want to cut off the connection between Pentus and the First Legion. As a nation on horseback, the Dothraki are actually not good at sieges. However, why can the Dothraki be invincible in siege warfare, become a destroyer of civilization, and destroy cities one after another? The reason is that the tactics that the Dothraki have long been rooted in their souls have fully utilized the advantages of being flexible on horseback and field combat against infantry. They can destroy the villages around the city, take away their food, and drive these displaced people to gather towards the city they are surrounded by. For the cities surrounded by the Dothraki, accepting these refugees means the consumption of food, and slaughtering them will also consume the city's defense supplies and hid morale. Many cities surrounded by the Dothraki face such a difficult choice. It is like a prey with a wolf biting its throat, and finally exhausting all its strength in the struggle. Chapter 258 Pirates. However, the Dothraki certainly didn't just have this one tactic to deal with the city walls. Their tactics had almost become muscle memory, and even if their Khal was a simple-minded guy, he still knew what to do. First, cut off the connection between us and Engelhard and create panic. Let Pentus not know the situation in Engelhard, and Engelhard also doesn't know what happened in Pentus. Jon Connington explained. As long as we don't dare to go out of the city to fight, it will be difficult to get in touch with the outside world if we hide behind the city walls. Fortunately, Pentus is close to the sea, and the Dothraki blockade is not complete. Even if the war goes wrong, Viserys will not be in danger of his life. The garrison and commander of Pentus can leave by boat, not to mention the dragons. Of course, this is an extreme situation, and perhaps the Dothraki are also thinking about this. If they can scare off the enemy without a single soldier, the Dothraki don't want to fight a hard battle. Then Jon paused slightly and continued. Block all the news. Every day when you open your eyes, you will see Dothraki outside the city. Not even a raven can fly out. Under such circumstances, anxiety and worry will arise. If one side can't help but want to go out of the city to fight and rescue the people on the other side, it will fall into the trap of the Dothraki. The Dothraki were able to shock the continent of Essos because of their unparalleled mobility and combat effectiveness in the wild. If the Unsullied had not fought with their backs against the city walls, perhaps the outcome of that legendary war would be unknown. The Dothraki are too good at playing with the psychology of their prey. They know what people are afraid of. John Clinton finally sighed and said, "So we just need to remember one thing, no matter what, don't go out of the city to fight with the Dothraki." Although it is said that the Dothraki are simple-minded, they are good at psychological warfare, including the roaring warriors. They make noise all the time to scare their prey, and eventually torture them to the point of moral collapse. Perhaps this is also a tactic they learned from the wolf pack. After John's words fell, there was silence in the conference hall. Everyone looked at each other except Viserys. Then Straw Dick couldn't help but ask, "Lord Clinton, do you mean that we can defeat the Dothraki as long as we hold on to the city?" After Dick finished speaking, everyone's eyes fell on the man with grey red hair again. Now they all knew each other's identity and knew that John was an experienced and excellent commander. John Clinton coughed lightly in the face of this question, then turned his head and looked at Viserys. Viserys was still looking down at the map. I don't know if he noticed John's gaze, but shook his head slightly. John Clinton immediately understood, then sighed and nodded. Yes, that's right. So as long as everyone holds on to the city and doesn't leave the city without permission, we will definitely defeat the Dothraki. In fact, John Clinton and Viserys certainly didn't tell the truth in the combat meeting during the day. If the Dothraki had no way out, just by hiding in the city, then I'm afraid it would be too much to underestimate this destroyer of civilization. Since the Dothraki left the Mother Mountain, they have destroyed countless citizen civilizations. They use their inferior civilization and barbarism to destroy a more advanced civilization. Although Viserys had entrusted John to coordinate war supplies a long time ago. However, the population of Pentos is still too large after all. These hundreds of thousands of people in the city will consume a lot of food and grass for a day. Fortunately, Pentos is a city close to the sea, and the Dothraki cannot block their waters. But the Bravos can. Some Bravos fleets have appeared outside the Bay of Pentos. They took off their flags and disguised themselves as pirates, robbing some merchant ships that wanted to enter Pentos without any background. Now, the night is deep. Viserys is wearing bright armor, and his long silver gold hair shines in the moonlight, hanging on the cold armor. At this moment, he is standing in the palace's parade ground, arranging his armor, and his mind is still thinking carefully. Stock up supplies and clear the fields. John had done everything he could, but the Dothraki still had sufficient supplies. The people behind the Dothraki were able to summon 5 Dothraki horse kings and supply such a large army. Of course, it was not to say that the Dothraki were dogs of the Braavosi, but they had instigated these people to fight against Viserys. Bravos. Viserys took a deep breath and clenched his fists slightly. The steel gloves reflected the moonlight and the knuckles of his fingers made a sound. Secretly tripping and assassinating, Viserys and Bravos had already had a feud. When he had time, he would make these arrogant Braavosi pay with blood sooner or later. At this time, under the dim moonlight, a huge figure fell from the sky and made a low roar. Balerion, who was resting outside Pentos, received Viserys' call, flew to Pentos, and landed in the spacious parade ground of the palace. John Connington is now stepping up defenses on the top of the city overnight to prevent the Dothraki from attacking at night. As the policy specified during the day, everyone else must stay in the city and use the advantage of the city wall to block the enemy's attack. However, Viserys and John knew that they could not defeat the Dothraki by just defending. And if the siege lasts too long, the 10,000 Andal soldiers in Bessie of the Castle of Sol on the other side are likely to be in danger, which Viserys cannot accept. Even if he knows that the other party is planning to besiege the point and attack the reinforcement, he can't help but get into the trap. So, the best solution must be to seize the opportunity in Pentos to defeat the main force of the Dothraki and stabilize the outcome of the battle. In this way, the siege of the Castle of Sol will naturally be solved. This time he was fully prepared, and a big net was gradually spread out. He wanted to swallow all the 50,000 Dothraki in one bite. Then, Viserys climbed onto Balerion's back. The black dragon roared, exerted force with its legs, spread its wings, and flew straight into the sky. Whoosh! Under the dim moonlight, Balerion's huge figure quickly disappeared above the clouds. Chapter 259, Facing Death. 2 days later in the afternoon, the gates of Pentus were already crowded with people, most of whom were refugees driven here by the Dothraki. Their homes were destroyed, and their wealth was looted. They were forced to flee their homes, and fled in a panic towards Pentus like pigs driven by the Dothraki. Many people who ran slowly died under the bows and scimitars of the Dothraki, and then laughed loudly, speaking in the obscure Dothraki language. Korami. Then he urged his horse forward, and pulled a woman out from the refugees, directly pulled her onto the horse's back, and then patted the horse's butt and rode away. Hey, you. The woman's husband looked like an honest farmer, and seemed to want to take back his wife. However, before he rushed over, he was cut in the throat by 2 other Dothraki with scimitars. Puff, blood spurted out. The husband covered his throat, and watched his wife being taken away, and then fell in a pool of blood. Small episodes like this are still happening on this land. These roaring warriors seem to be playing a killing game, and several Dothraki are not fast. They can drive hundreds of unarmed refugees to flee towards Pentus by leisurely walking in the back on horseback. From time to time, they urge their horses to kill a few slow-running sheep people, or use bows and arrows to take people who are supporting each other with their families as live targets. But these people don't even have the courage to fight back. Now that the Dothraki army has arrived, a large number of people in towns near Pentus have been driven here. This is one of the Dothraki tactics. If Pentus refuses to accept these refugees, it will lose morale, and if it accepts them, it will need to consume its own food reserves. However, the Dothraki army is not far from here, and the desolate and melodious horn sound can be heard from afar. But Viserys still withstood the pressure, and opened the city gate to let these poor refugees escape into the city of Pentus. The Dothraki who drove the refugees here reined in their horses not far from the city gate. They laughed at the refugees crowded at the city gate, and provoked the Targaryen soldiers on the top of the city wall. They jumped off their horses, and urinated on the top of the city wall, letting them watch them shoot the refugees fleeing to the city gate one by one. The Targaryen soldiers on the top of Pentus, including the mercenaries of the Windblown, clenched their fists when they saw this scene. Damn it. These bastards. I'm going to kill them. Wolf from the woodland held his sword tightly, and felt that his blood rushed to his head when he saw the scene in front of him. He wanted to rush down and kill all these damn bastards right now. However, at this moment, boom boom, the side door next to the sunrise gate of the main city gate of Pentus opened wide, and a team of fully armed Targaryen knights rushed out of it. The Dothraki who drove the refugees here were completely unprepared, and suddenly encountered the Targaryen cavalry head-on. Perhaps they did not expect that these iron cans hiding in the stone house would dare to rush out directly at this time. You know, the Dothraki army is behind them, and now it is not far from Pentus. Shori Tornikov. The Dothraki who drove the refugees exclaimed, which means people wearing iron clothes in Dothraki. Although they were caught off guard, they were not afraid. Instead of running away, they drew the axe scimitars at their waists, and rushed forward with loud shouts. Boom boom, in an instant. The cavalry of both sides collided violently, and made a huge sound in an instant. Metal and iron collided, flesh and blood squeezed together, and there were also shrill screams. Kill all these bastards. John Connington, wearing bright armor, a helmet on his head, holding a long sword in his hand, led the Targaryen knights to rush into the enemy camp first, and killed several Dothraki in succession. Clang clang clang. The sound of metal and iron colliding violently was mixed, and flesh and blood flew everywhere. Although the Dothraki were proficient in riding, they still suffered a great loss in the head-on collision with the cavalry. After all, the first priority of cavalry combat is speed. The Targaryen knights came aggressively, while the roaring warriors of the Dothraki reined in their horses, and did not move. When they saw someone rushing out, they drew their swords to meet him. However, they were instantly at a disadvantage in terms of speed and impact. Moreover, the Dothraki did not have an advantage in weapons and equipment. Their scimitars could hardly split the plate armor worn by the Targaryen soldiers, and even a white mark was left when they chopped them up. Then they were chopped to the ground by the Targaryen soldiers, who held a sword in one hand and a shield in the other, and were instantly trampled into meat paste by the horses' hooves. Herodias, the war horse neighed. Naki, os. The two sides had just engaged in battle. The Dothraki formation instantly heard the voices of stop and retreat. Although the Dothraki were reckless, they were not fools. This kind of Arnken was indeed difficult to deal with, but not everyone in the Targaryen army was qualified to wear such tin cans. The Dothraki were still following orders this time. With the shouts of retreat, they retreated like a tide towards the main force of the distant army. John Connington, who was already covered in blood not long after the battle, took 2 deep breaths, wiped the blood off his face, and watched the Dothraki fleeing into the distance without chasing them. Instead, he waved his hand. Retreat. Go back to the city. Tram TTTTT. Then the group of Targaryen knights who covered the refugees into the city turned their horses and retreated towards the city of Pentus. At this time, in the distance, woo, the desolate horn sounded suddenly, like a wave of the sea. Rumble. Then the endless Dothraki appeared in the eyes of the soldiers on the top of the city of Pentus. At the same time, beep, the horns on the top of Pentus also sounded, and at the same time, the bells rang, warning the whole city. Close the city gates. The commander on the top of the city conveyed the order. Close the city gates. The soldiers in charge of the city gates began to pull the ropes, and the winches made a loud creaking sound, and the city gates were slowly closing. The refugees who had not yet entered the city rushed to the city gates like crazy. John Connington and the knights he led to protect the refugees were even blocked at the end. They could only watch the Dothraki people who were sweeping in like waves in the distance gradually approaching. Roar, roar, roar. The earth trembled under the horses' hooves, and the earth-shaking howling sounded. John felt that he had even smelled the disgusting smell of the Dothraki people. Damn it. Then the man with grey red hair gritted his teeth slightly and drew out his bloody sword again. Brothers, turn the horses around. Prepare to meet the enemy, John Connington said loudly. All the Targaryen knights who were leaving the city turned their horses around, acting like knights ready to die. However, John had not yet finished his last words, to protect the people and retreat, when he suddenly felt the sky above his head suddenly become gloomy. Whoosh, the violent wind was howling, the dust was flying, and John was a little embarrassed. The next second, a huge black shadow spread its wings and flew over the knights' heads, swooping directly towards the Dothraki army in the distance. Unexpected point JPG. Chapter 260 Dragon Flame. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Viserys rode on the dragon's back. The howling wind on both sides constantly poured into his ears. He was wearing bright silver armor, a helmet on his head, and his long silver gold hair fluttered in the wind. He tightly grasped the scales on the dragon's back with both hands, slightly turned sideways, and looked down at the endless Dothraki below with a pair of lavender eyes. The Dothraki who were charging below also raised their heads at this time, and looked at the huge monster that suddenly appeared above their heads. Rumble. A huge shadow was shrouding the ground, and was quickly approaching. The wings flapped, and the wind rolled up the dust. It was very close to the ground, with an incomparable strong sense of oppression. Balerion opened his huge mouth and let out a low roar. The sound spread far away, and resounded throughout the battlefield. All the Dothraki who were charging at the front suddenly panicked. After all, this was a terrible monster they had never seen before. Although the Dothraki were fearless, and believed that they would turn into stars in the sky after death, they were extremely superstitious, and would classify anything that had no meaning as a miracle, just as the fire that Viserys had set was considered by the Dothraki to be the blood magic of a witch. Gian. Voyager. The Dothraki were in chaos and their charge formation became loose. All the Dothraki tried their best to control the horses under their crotch with the reins, shouting out words similar to gods, but with some unclear meanings. Their mounts were also obviously frightened and neighed one after another. This sudden appearance of a huge monster was much more frightening than a tiger, and it aroused the instinctive fear of the horses as creatures. The roaring Dothraki warriors shouted loudly, and controlled the horses under their crotch with the reins, to prevent them from running away. Viserys rode on the dragon's back, his long hair fluttering in the wind, his eyes fixed on the Dothraki below who were in a state of chaos. Then he took a deep breath and spoke in a cold and low voice in standard high Valyrian. Dracarys. Dragon flame. The next second. Boom. A dazzling red pillar of fire fell from the sky and hit the ground. It directly submerged the Dothraki who were restraining their frightened horses in the chaos. The flames shot up into the sky in an instant on this empty plain. There were shrill screams and the crackling sound of flames burning flesh and fat. I don't know how many Dothraki were instantly turned into ashes under the burning of the dragon flame. And there were more Dothraki who were affected by the pillar of fire hitting the ground, and their bodies were bathed in flames, and they let out shrill screams. The horses under their crotches had long been out of control, burning with flames, running away like crazy, breaking into the ranks of more frightened Dothraki, causing greater chaos. The wailing, screaming, the sound of flesh being burned through, and obscure curses, along with the aroma of barbecue, spread rapidly into the distance. Whoosh! Balerion spread his wings, and his dragon flame split the earth, plowing a deep gully in the Dothraki who were as dark as the sea. And in the distance, surrounded by the blood guards, the three cows felt a little tingling when they saw this scene. Is this Viserys' dragon? They lived in the east of the continent, although they had heard that the Valyrian Dragon King once ruled this continent. Later, they heard that behind the distant Norvus Mountains, a wandering cow from the other side of the narrow sea hatched an extinct dragon. However, the Dothraki Horse King did not take the legendary dragon seriously. When the Valyrian dragon was rampant, the ancestors of the Dothraki were still hiding in their ancestral land, drinking blood and eating raw meat as barbarians. There are not many records about dragons in the Dothraki memory and heritage, and even if that wandering cow had the legendary dragon, how big could it grow in just a few years? Including Khal Jacko and Khal Pono, who had a relationship with Viserys, but actually Viserys did not know their names at all. They looked at each other. Then, a low and vast roar came from above their heads. The three cows below were mixed in the crowd of Dothraki, and did not seem very obvious. They all raised their heads, and looked at the huge figure above their heads, watching it hovering and dancing above the Dothraki army, spewing large pieces of dragon flames from time to time to cover the ground. A large number of Dothraki warriors were wrapped in the raging flames. Both the men and the horses screamed and struggled for a few times, then fell into the flames. Viserys rode on the back of the dragon, holding the scales tightly with both hands, feeling the whistling of the wind in his ears. This was his first time riding Balerion to fight, and he had no experience in fighting. At this time, Viserys suddenly felt that he should find an opportunity to make a suitable set of equipment for Balerion, so that it would be more convenient to ride. As expected, practice makes perfect. However, the idea in his mind was only a flash, and he was now looking for the positions of the three cows in the Dothraki army in the sky. Viserys fully learned from the experience of defeating Khal Drogo before, and he must capture the king first when dealing with the Dothraki. If a Khal in the Dothraki army died, the entire cows would collapse in an instant and fall into a state of fragmentation. The remaining few cows would lead their people to withdraw from the battlefield, leaving some strength for the next fight for the cow. But it was a pity that Viserys squinted his eyes and tried to distinguish the Dothraki below who were as dense as the sea. They were mixed together. Most of them wore painted animal skin vests and horsehair leggings, and the cows would not wear more special clothes, but their braids might be very long. But Viserys looked down from such a high distance, coupled with Balerion's flying speed, it was difficult for him to distinguish which one was their cow. Balerion, have you found their leader? The silver gold long hair danced in the wind, and Viserys asked with both hands tightly grasping the scales. However, Balerion hovered in the air, then lowered the altitude, and spewed out a red blazing fire, making a roar. It also did not find who the leader of these little ants was. And on the ground below, Balerion's huge figure passed over the heads of the three Dothraki horse kings, and the heavy breathing of the dragon was like thunder. Rumble, followed by a huge roar, and a sea of fire descended behind them. Chapter 261 Dragon's Lair. The three cows had learned their lesson. They knew that Viserys was looking for them. They hid in the crowd without revealing any flaws, and deceived Viserys' eyes. Then, looking at the dazzling pillar of fire falling from the sky behind them, cold sweat slid down their foreheads. Although the Dothraki were fearless, that was just to encourage the tribesmen in the tribe. As a cow, he still hoped to live one more day. Is this a dragon? It's simply a devil. Although the Dothraki warriors are brave, how can they deal with such a devil? Khal Jacko, who had crawled out from under the horse's belly, was still a little frightened. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and couldn't help but speak. When the terrible behemoth swooped down quickly, he could even smell the pungent sulfur on the other side. He really thought he was going to die. Fortunately, the dragon did not spit flames over their heads. Cal Jacko expressed the thoughts of everyone present, and even Cal Pono, who was not on good terms with him, rarely agreed with his point of view. There was no way to continue this battle. Although the Dothraki horses have been well trained, they will still be frightened when facing fierce beasts such as tigers and leopards. This is the instinctive reaction of animals, and it is even more difficult to control the horses when facing the terrifying dragons, unless they are familiar with them. Most of the strength of the Dothraki lies on the back of horses. If the horses are not effective in facing the dragons, the threat of the Dothraki will be eliminated. Dear Horse Kings. At this time, a man with neatly trimmed short hair and plain grey robes who followed the 3 Horse Kings spoke in High Valyrian. He was also frightened by the figure of the dragon swooping down, and he thought he was going to die just now. He even saw the dragon rider sitting on the back of the dragon. But now he can no longer recognize the other person. The boy who first came to Bravos 8 years ago looked calm on the surface, but in fact there was still panic in his eyes that could not be concealed. Trembling with fear, treading on thin ice. But now, Viserys rode on the back of the dragon and swooped down towards the army. The dragon's flames burned the earth, and the Dothraki Horse King, who was known for his bravery, was frightened and hid under the horse's belly. Cleon looked up at the back of the dragon in the sky and sighed slightly. He was the alderman of Bravos who received Viserys off the ship 8 years ago. Then Cleon retracted his gaze and looked at the 3 Dothraki Horse Kings in front of him, as well as their blood guards. Dear Dothraki Horse Kings, do you remember the weapons Bravos gave you to fight against dragons? Now is the time to use them. The Dothraki people did not produce anything, and the siege weapons they built were simply not worth looking at. They were crudely made, so Bravos gave them weapons to fight against dragons, which were giant crossbows called dragon killers. However, due to the hit rate, it was not so easy for the giant crossbow to hit a fast flying dragon. And with the dragon's body, as long as it is not directly hit in the vital parts such as the eyes, it can survive a few hits. Bravos mainly hopes to use the crossbow to limit the performance of the black dragon under Viserys. At least it will not be so unscrupulous. However, although poor and penniless, the Dothraki arrogantly do not want to use these weapons. They believe that the warriors of Dothraki can defeat any enemy. Although they finally accepted these crossbows, they did not intend to use them. They just dragged them with horses at the back of the army, and together with the baggage carts. Now the words of Cleon, the messenger of Bravos, were translated into Dothraki and told to the Khals. Then these Khals looked at each other, and then they remembered that the Bravos seemed to have given them weapons to fight against the dragon. Jacko Cal and Pono Cal, who had long braids, looked at each other and always felt that their faces were a little embarrassed, and the grey-haired Mozza Cal pondered for a moment and then spoke in Dothraki. Just do as the Bravos messenger says. The old Cal had lived for so many years and had long understood some truths. He didn't care about the so-called face, and then waved his hand. Bring out those giant crossbows. Yes, the blood of my blood. At Mozza's command, his blood guards stood up, jumped on their horses, turned their horses' heads, and galloped towards the place where the giant crossbows were stored behind them, ignoring the dragon flames that were not extinguished behind them. The blood guards of Jacko and Pono did not move a step, but just watched coldly. Although the 3 Khals have now cooperated and formed a coalition to attack Pentos together, these Dothraki people who usually fight each other in civil wars cannot let go of all their hatred overnight. They only listen to their own Khals, and they will not move a step without their Khals speaking. In the sky, the wind is still howling. Viserys sat on the dragon's back and lay down to avoid the rain of arrows below. After the initial panic, the Dothraki gradually launched a counterattack under the command of their respective Cascus. The Dothraki are good at scimitars, short bows and long whips. The short bow is a double curved bow suitable for horseback shooting, made of bent animal horns, wood or animal bones. The Dothraki and Ornish people are particularly fond of this bow because they can easily use this bow to throw deadly arrows at the enemy on horseback instead of shooting at the target one by one. Bang, bang, bang. The bowstring sounded one after another like raindrops hitting the ground. The overwhelming rain of arrows shot towards Ballywian who was swooping down, but the hard scales of the dragon could block these ordinary arrows. Clang, clang, clang. The rain of arrows thrown by the Dothraki bows fell on Balerian's scales, making a metallic collision sound, and fell to the ground one after another. At this time, bang, a sudden loud sound of a bowstring bursting out covered the sound of other bowstrings being ejected. A 2-meter long spear flew out, making a sharp sound of breaking through the air, and flew straight to Balerian in the sky. Ho! The black dragon's eyes were sharp and his wisdom was high. He saw the threatening spear at a glance, then let out a low roar, and tilted his head slightly in mid-air. Whoosh! The spear fired by the giant crossbow rushed straight into the sky from a position more than 10 meters next to Balerian's head. Giant crossbow. Viserys, who was lying on the dragon's back, saw this scene and his heart sank slightly. Although the giant crossbow had a very low hit rate, the opponent could indeed pose a threat to the dragon. Balerian! Viserys shouted in a low voice. Balerian seemed to be enraged, and sprayed a mouthful of dragon flame at the place where the giant crossbow had just been fired. Rumble! The flames once again cleansed the earth. The bravest soldiers who fired the crossbows let out shrill screams. Chapter 262 Return. Balerian vented his anger by spewing out flames, which engulfed several giant crossbows on the ground. Whoosh, whoosh, then several more spears flew into the air, but they were all crooked. Then the black dragon roared at Viserys' command, raised its altitude, spread its wings, and flew back to the distant direction of Pentos. Whoosh, whoosh. In the afternoon sun, the huge figure of the dragon was gradually disappearing, and its scales reflected the light of metal. The chaotic Dothraki on the ground stabilized slightly, but still shot several spears at the back of the black dragon, as if venting their anger. However, Balerian had already flown to a very high distance at this moment, and the spears fired by the giant crossbow flew into the air, and then lost their power, and then fell down. On the battlefield, the Dothraki warriors controlled their mounts, combed the horse's mane with their hands, hugged the horse's neck, and comforted their companions' nervous emotions. The best partner of every Dothraki is his own warhorse. This guy finally retreated. The 3 khals hiding among the tribesmen breathed a sigh of relief when they saw the terrifying dragon spread its wings and flew away. Just now, their lives were really hanging by a thread. If the khal riding the dragon found them, or if they were unlucky and the fire fell from the sky on their heads, they would really die. This time, the expedition plan of the Dothraki people and 5 khals and 80,000 Dothraki roaring warriors became a laughingstock. After all, 3 of them were burned to death by the khal riding the dragon in the first battle. Fortunately, this did not happen. It seems that those dragon killers are still effective. Although the giant crossbow did not hit a single shot, at least the raging dragon retreated because of it, which means that it is still effective. The 3 khals breathed a sigh of relief, and were slightly excited. It is good that there is something to fear about such a terrifying monster, otherwise they really don't know how to fight this battle. On the other side, the young king personally rode a dragon to fight, and blocked the aggressive attack of the Dothraki alone. The magnificent scene of the burning wilderness shocked people's hearts. A deafening cheer came from the top of Pentos. The morale of the Pentos defenders instantly rose, and having a dragon to fight together was extremely boosting. On the bloody night half a year ago, although many of the current Pentos defenders had experienced that war, but at that time, some of them had knelt down to surrender, and some were still mercenaries of the Windblown group. They did not directly participate in the Battle of the Prince's Palace, and did not have the most intuitive impression of the power of the dragon. However, now, including the crowded refugees outside Pentos, they also witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Their homes were all destroyed by the Dothraki, their families were slaughtered, and their wealth was plundered. Now seeing such a scene, of course, they couldn't help but burst into tears. And John Clinton led the cavalry out of the city to cover the refugees, and saw this scene. The grey red-haired man took off his helmet, and held it in his arms. There was still blood on his face, that had not been wiped clean. He took a deep breath, turned his head to look at the dragon in the sky returning to Pentos, and then took a deep breath. Enter the city. Then he urged the warhorse under his crotch, and the sound of horse hooves sounded, leading the cavalry who went out of the city, to cover the refugees to finally return to the city. Close the city gate. Close the city gate. The commander on the top of the city also gave orders at this time. Click. Then the soldiers pulled the rope, the winch made a sound that made people's teeth ache, and the huge city gate slammed shut. With the closure of the city gate, the entire huge city-state was completely closed and became impregnable. Hun Viserys rode Balerion and flew to a wide open space in Pentus that was large enough to accommodate the dragon. Boom. The dragon landed with a heavy sound, raising dust that slowly drifted away. Balerion stretched his neck slightly and let out a low roar. "Thank you for your hard work." Viserys patted Balerion's neck gently, then stood up from the black dragon's back. His armor reflected the light in the sun, and his long hair was freely scattered. Then he jumped down from the black dragon's back along its broad wings. Bang! "Your Majesty." At this time, a guard came forward and took the helmet that Viserys had taken off. "Yes." Viserys also nodded, then walked towards the direction of the city wall and spoke as he walked. "Prepare more food for Balerion and let him have a good rest." Balerion had just made a great effort, so Viserys naturally couldn't treat his partner badly. Whether he could face an enemy that was 2 or 3 times his own and defeat the enemy depended mainly on Balerion's performance. "Understood, Your Majesty." The guards following Viserys nodded in agreement and ordered the logistics support to bring 2 cows to Lord Balerion. Trample. Viserys also hurriedly climbed the wall. The soldiers on both sides of the road cast enthusiastic eyes on him. They had just witnessed the scene of His Majesty the King riding a dragon to turn the tide. In their impression, Viserys was now a godlike figure. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." Viserys also nodded slightly. At this time, Jon Connington had also taken off his blood-stained armor and climbed onto the top of the city. He was holding the battlement and looking at the Dothraki in the distance. Then he heard the movement behind him and turned his head to see Viserys coming over. "Your Majesty." The man with long grey red hair nodded and saluted, and Viserys also came to his side and looked into the distance. After the baptism of dragon flames, the arrogance of the Dothraki was mostly extinguished. At this moment, the morale became much lower. It seemed that they were no longer prepared to attack Pentus today. Instead, they slowly retreated back like the ebb tide, preparing to camp first, set up tents, dig pits, and cook. "Jon, what do you think is the possibility of defeating the Dothraki if we go out of the city to pursue them now?" Viserys was silent for a moment as he watched the Dothraki retreat in the distance, then turned around and suddenly asked, "No, Your Majesty." Jon was thinking about other things in his mind and was startled when he heard Viserys' words and then hurriedly spoke to stop him. He knew that Viserys had defeated the Dothraki in a field battle and was quite confident. However, the situation in Pentus is different now. There are still many major problems. Chapter 263 Siege. The Pentus garrison is now roughly divided into several groups. One part is the former Pentus garrison soldiers who had heard that all the governors had been burned to death and surrendered. The other part is the former windblown mercenaries. The individual combat effectiveness of the windblown mercenaries is not bad, but the discipline is still very poor. Even after Jon's training, the time is still not enough to change the bad habits. The former garrison soldiers are probably in the same situation. They are all veterans who are willing to take bribes and cannot play a strong combat effectiveness in real battles. In addition, because the war is approaching, Pentus has temporarily hired many mercenaries and wandering knights. The combat effectiveness of these people combined is really elite, gathering the best of all parties. If you really take these people away from the city wall and rush out to hunt down the Dothraki, I'm afraid it will really be a meat bun hitting a dog, and there will be no return. Your Majesty, we only need to defend the walls to stop the Dothraki. There's no need to go out and take this risk. Jon Connington hurriedly dissuaded Viserys from this bold idea. Although the dragon's deterrent power is very strong, the main body of the war is still the army and soldiers, and the dragon is just a heavyweight that affects the outcome of the war. Jon had persuaded Viserys about this since he first met him. As a king, he should still focus on his people and his soldiers. Aegon conquered Westeros not only with dragons. He was afraid that Viserys would become famous at a young age and then become too arrogant, relying too much on dragons to solve problems. In the end, he became a person like his father, the Mad King, who was overly obsessed with power and tried to maintain his rule by creating fear. But Jon was fortunate that Viserys did not seem to be such a tyrant at the moment. If all the soldiers of Pentus died, Viserys and a dragon would not be able to defend such a huge city-state. In the end, He just rode on the dragon and abandoned the city and fled. Viserys smiled when Jon stopped him and shook his head slightly. He also knew in his heart that the soldiers of Pentus were not the unsullied, nor were they the elite Andal warriors he had led. Such soldiers who collapsed at the first blow could not fight a field battle with the Dothraki. Losing the protection of the city wall would be a disaster for these people. Well, I see. Viserys nodded slightly. Then he looked at the Dothraki camping in the distance. It seemed that the Dothraki were not going to attack the city today, and he lost interest in watching. Then the young king turned and walked down the city wall. 80,000 Dothraki were divided on the Great Plains. The main force was 3 Khals leading 50,000 howling warriors to attack Pentus. On the other side were 30,000 Dothraki led by Khal Jiko and Khal Moro. They wanted to break through the Fort of Hell and then march north to Andalus. These Dothraki who were divided to attack the Fort of Hell encountered their enemies earlier than the main force. The earliest battle was on the banks of the Rhoyne River. A group of scattered 1st Legion cavalry encountered the Dothraki and engaged in a fierce battle. In the end, both sides lost some soldiers and retreated, and received the news that the Dothraki army was approaching. The commander-in-chief of the Legion, Bessie Joyce, also ordered to shrink the defense line. 10,000 Andal warriors returned to the camp and climbed the walls and castles to prepare for the attack of the Dothraki. The Castle of Souls is still a semi-finished castle, and most of the soldiers are stationed in semi-permanent camps. Therefore, they are almost fighting the Dothraki in the field, and the pressure is huge. Bessie retreated first under caution and showed weakness to the enemy. Fortunately, the 1st Legion is composed of the elite Andal warriors who followed Viserys the earliest. They have defeated Khal Drogo's troops and are not afraid of the Dothraki. Unlike the Pentus garrison, they are one of the few troops that can fight the Dothraki in the field. It's just that this time the Dothraki army has too many more people than them, so they are forced to switch to defense. A man in military uniform and a metal mask climbed up to the top of the city wall. Commander-in-chief. Commander-in-chief. The Andal soldiers on the towering walls of the castle quickly made way for their commander-in-chief and greeted him. Bessie held the railing with his hands, and his walking posture was still a little awkward. He was wearing bright armor and a white battle robe. The morning sun shone on his body, as if the holy light of the 7 gods was bestowed on him. The 7-pointed star symbol on the forehead of the mask added a bit of sacred color. He is the son of a warrior. The gods have given him courage and strength, and entrusted him with the sacred duty of defeating the enemy. May the warriors bless us. Because of his physical discomfort, Bessie stood on the wall with a crooked posture, and then he spoke in a hoarse and calm voice. His pair of dark eyes were bright, and his breathing was even. He looked at the endless Dothraki under the castle and the refugees they drove away without any tension. May the warriors bless us. The soldiers following Bessie Joyce had the emblem of the Targaryen 3-headed dragon on their armor, and a small 7-pointed star on their chests. They also roared in unison. It is obvious that the Andal people on the Andal plains have a fanatical belief in the 7 gods. This belief is also the driving force for their tenacious resistance to the attack of the Dothraki. Recently, this is the land of the Andals in the Dothraki language. Riding on the tallest warhorse in the distance, Dothraki horse king Khal drew out the Arak scimitar from his waist, pointed the tip of the knife directly at the distant Hell of Souls, and roared, "Kill them all. Tear down their stone houses. Take away their wealth. Rape their women." Behind Hell of Souls is the rich and peaceful Andal plains. The sacred 7 gods once descended on this land and crowned the Andal king. Then, the endless Dothraki blew the siege horn, driving the captured refugees to the bottom of the castle. Commander-in-chief, what should we do? On the top of the Black Castle, some soldiers of the 1st Legion felt a little numb when they saw this scene, and then turned their heads to look at their commander. These refugees rushing over will impact the horse traps, trenches and wooden chevauchés that they have arranged in advance. And Bess's eyes narrowed slightly under the mask, and took a deep breath. Tell them to stop moving forward and hide under the city wall. What if they don't listen? The soldier asked, and Bessie glanced at the soldier and didn't say anything. Then he refused the guard's help and staggered towards the tower alone. Then time passed quickly. Soon, the first day of the siege was over. The Dothraki threw away the corpses all over the ground and slowly retreated like a tide. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 264 Negotiation. Under the setting sun, soldiers on the top of the castle of Angel Saul were cleaning up the battlefield, throwing corpses down from the top of the castle, including the corpses of their comrades. The space in the castle and the camp was limited, and there was no place to store the corpses, and they could even be burned. After all, this was just a semi-finished castle that had not been fully built, plus a semi-permanent camp. 10,000 soldiers of the 1st Legion were stationed here, relying on the castle and the tall wooden walls of the barracks, where supplies were stored. Therefore, the situation of the besieged 1st Legion was much more dangerous than that of Pentus, and they had almost no geographical advantages to occupy. The Dothraki focused on attacking the camp area without the protection of the city wall, which was equivalent to fighting a continuous tug-of-war with the Dothraki on the plains. After a whole day of fighting, the Legion's camp had been breached several times, but in the end they were stubbornly resisted. Now they are cleaning up the battlefield and rushing to repair the damage. In the headquarters meeting hall of Angel Saul, the commanders of the kingdom's 1st Legion gathered together. Bessie Joyce, the Legion commander who was born a civilian, was still dressed in military uniform and wearing a metal mask. She sat in the center. There was also a golden sword and shield medal on his chest. On both sides of his seat were 2 rows of knights in shining helmets. They were all commanders of the Legion. They wore armor with the Targaryen 3-headed dragon emblem and the 7-pointed star symbol representing the 7 gods on their chests. One of the commanders couldn't help but speak up. "Your Majesty can't defeat the Dothraki by holding on, Commander-in-Chief. And your Majesty is now besieged in Pentus, and we can't even release the ravens." Several ravens released by the Castle of Souls in the past few days were shot down by the Dothraki. Only one raven was more alert and flew high to escape, but no news has been sent back yet. "That's right." Others also echoed. "I have a suggestion, Commander-in-Chief." Another commander also stood up. He proposed to fight outside the city and imitate the kerosene tactics used by His Majesty in the past to burn the Dothraki to death. Others proposed more diverse ideas, such as stretching the battle line, forming a shield formation, and using cavalry to flank and charge to cut the battlefield. It can be seen that the grassroots commanders of the 1st Legion are much stronger than the defenders of Pentus. At least they have experienced regular military training and the baptism of blood and fire. However, Bessie, who was sitting at the head, remained silent. Since he rushed into the sea of fire and was severely burned, he has become much more taciturn. After all the commanders expressed their opinions, Bessie raised his head slightly and spoke in a hoarse and low voice. "Everyone, behind us is the Anspleen, the home of our ancestors." His eyes looked around all the faces on his left and right, and his voice came from under the metal mask. "Prince Oberyn's reinforcement will arrive soon. We will not continue to defend. We must seize the time to deal with the enemy in front of us, and then go to Pentus to rescue His Majesty." The commander-in-chief's voice echoed in the conference room. He had decided not to defend the castle to the death. He knew that the Dothraki who surrounded the castle were not their main force. The main force of the enemy must be besieging Pentus. Although Bessie knew very well that the Dothraki were just planning to attack the reinforcement. However, he had sworn to protect the safety of His Majesty the King and live up to Viserys' trust in him. Therefore, Bessie first shrank the defense line, put on a posture of defending to the death, showed the enemy weakness, and let the Dothraki relax their vigilance. Then he was ready to seize the moment when the enemy was relaxed and defeat the enemy in front of him in one go. All the grassroots commanders of the Legion were shocked when they heard the words, knowing that the commander-in-chief decided to go out of the city and fight a decisive battle with the Dothraki who were several times their number. However, instead of feeling fear, they were excited. Then they stood up in unison and hammered their chests with one hand. For the king. The continent of Essos was surging. All the free trade cities set their sights on the war that was breaking out on the Great Plains at this moment. The ancient Valyrian road was even cut off, seriously affecting the trade routes to Norvus and Koha. You know, the ancient trade route of Pentus Novus Coha has been maintained for many years, and has long become the economic lifeline of several inland cities. And in the distant Westeros, the end of the world, King Robert led the coalition of the nobles of the 7 countries, and arrived at Winterfell a long time ago after a 2-month-long journey. Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, a pair of good brothers who are not related by blood, finally met again. Then they rushed to the wall together. Because there are more and more wild men hoarding there, the conflict between the Free People and the Night's Watch is constantly intensifying. The Night's Watch unexpectedly sent a team of rangers to wipe out a small tribe, killing all the people regardless of gender, age or young. However, a team of northern troops who also went out to clean up were ambushed by wild men. The cruel Thens even skinned and pulled out the captives of the northern army and sent them to the barbecue grill to be roasted and eaten in a position visible on the wall. The two sides accumulated deep hatred after a few exchanges. However, in this tense background, the king of the Wild Kingdom suddenly sent out an envoy. They heard from the captives that the king of the south seemed to have come here, so they sent an envoy to negotiate with the king of the south. The envoy stated his identity and was taken into the Black Castle to meet Robert Baratheon, the king of the south who had just arrived at the wall. The envoy did not say any nonsense and directly stated that the footsteps of the White Walkers behind them were getting closer and closer. The real winter has not yet arrived, but it is not far away. The envoy of the Wild Kingdom required Robert to open the city gate to let the Free People outside the wall pass through the wall, otherwise all their people would die. And Mance Rayder's envoy also said that they had found the legendary winter horn on the fist of the first men. Legend has it that more than 1,000 years ago, the king beyond the wall, Joman, blew the horn of winter to awaken the sleeping giants underground. If the horn of winter is blown, it will also cause the wall to collapse. If the kings of the 7 kingdoms are not prepared to let hundreds of thousands of free people pass through the wall to live in the warm south, then Mance Rayder is ready to blow this artifact to cause the wall to collapse and let the 7 kingdoms and hundreds of thousands of free people perish together. Chapter 265, Horn of Winter. However, the Wildlings' envoys were also timid. They seemed to want to intimidate the king of the south. In the eyes of the Wildlings, these kneeling people living behind the Great Wall were all soft eggs, and they would be afraid with just a little intimidation. However, the Wildlings' envoys never expected that he would hit a wall this time. His threats not only did not scare the fat king in front of him, but angered Robert Baratheon. Perhaps the envoy had not inquired about the kind of person he was negotiating with before coming to the wall. After all, King's Landing was too far away for them, and for the Wildlings, everything south of the wall was called the South. You'd better get out of here before I decide to cut off your tongue and stuff it into your asshole. King Robert was soft-hearted, his eyes widened like copper bells, and then drove the envoy out. He didn't believe that a winter horn that came out of nowhere would cause such a magnificent wall to collapse once it was blown. Although Robert was angry, he was not a cruel tyrant. If it was Aerys, the messenger would have been burned to death. He drove away the Wildling messenger and asked him to tell the king beyond the wall. Tell that bastard who once betrayed the oath of the Night's Watch. Robert said loudly, his voice buzzing in the meeting room. If you thieves and rapists living outside the wall want to pass through the wall, you must kneel down and surrender to the king of the 7 kingdoms and pray to the 7 gods to forgive his sins, and then make a choice between the gallows and the black clothes. King Robert roared with his beard puffed and his eyes glared. He knew that the Wildlings were lawless criminals. They called themselves free people to distinguish themselves from the kneeling people who knelt down to the lords and kings south of the wall. The free people believed that the kneeling people lacked freedom, but Robert wanted them to kneel down now. Then, the fat king with a beard on his face took another drink from the wine glass, snorted twice and continued to speak. Of course, this is for ordinary Wildlings. The guy named Mance Rayder who betrayed the oath of the Night's Watch, he no longer has the chance to wear black clothes. He must be sent to the gallows. King Robert can forgive other Wildlings, but it does not mean that he can forgive the guy who calls himself king beyond the wall. Mance Rayder should be punished according to the rules of the Night's Watch, Your Majesty. At this time, Eddard Stark, who was sitting next to him, spoke with dark brown hair and grey eyes, and his face was full of seriousness. I will hold a fair trial for him and listen to his reasons. Eddard Stark abides by honor and justice. He will listen to the reasons why Mance Rayder betrayed the Night's Watch. Then he will personally chop off the head of the king beyond the wall with the family heirloom Valyrian steel sword ice. Then the Wildling envoy was driven out of the Black Castle. After the Wildling's messengers were driven away, the Night's Watch and the reinforcement from the north and other places were rushing to set up defenses. They thought the Wildlings would come to attack in anger, but they waited and waited, but there was no news. What about the Horn of Winter that could blow down the wall? What about the hundreds of thousands of Wildlings? The 300-mile-long and 700-foot-high wall gave the coalition and the Night's Watch enough confidence. Everyone was relieved. In their opinion, no one could break through such a magnificent wall, not even hundreds of thousands of Wildlings, and not even the so-called White Walkers. Later, the news of the failed negotiations was brought back to the haunted forest by the messenger. In the Wildling army, the arrogant words of the King of the South made all the Wildling tribal leaders explode. They were unwilling to kneel to the so-called king for freedom, and Mance Rayder united hundreds of tribes, and ended the infighting among the Wildlings. Therefore, he had an unparalleled reputation among these free people, and was elected as the king beyond the wall. They could not kneel to the King of the South, and it was even more impossible for them to hand over their king, and have his head chopped off by the Lord of the South. Hundreds of tribal chiefs and leaders were clamoring to storm the wall. However, as the protagonist mentioned, Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, seemed very calm, and did not show any anger. He stopped all the tribal chiefs from asking for battle, and asked them to calm down. Because he knew very well that with the support of the king and nobles behind the wall, they could not break through the wall. However, Mance Rayder did not want to blow the Horn of Winter until it was absolutely necessary. If the wall really collapsed, then humans would lose the only barrier against the White Walkers, and catastrophic consequences would likely occur. However, if the King of the South was determined not to let the free people pass, then Mance Rayder would have no choice. He had to be responsible for his people, and he did not want to be beheaded. At that time, he could only blow the Horn of Winter, to let the wall collapse, and then lead his people out. Whether humans live or die next has nothing to do with him. Therefore, in order not to destroy both sides, Mance Rayder restrained his anger. Then he calmly sent another envoy to negotiate with King Robert frankly. The free peoples kneeling to the King of the South and asking for their heads were absolutely unacceptable conditions. This was Mance Rayder's bottom line. Then, the second envoy of the negotiation was brought into the Black Castle. However, this time the envoy of the free people was much more humble. He did not come up and clamor to blow the Horn of Winter so that the wall would collapse and everyone would perish together. Unfortunately, this time the envoy of the free people showed a sincere attitude, but after the last farce, King Robert no longer believed in the Horn of Winter. In his opinion, if the other party really had such a magical artifact, they would have blown the horn long ago, and then smashed the coalition forces of the 7 countries to death and directly invaded the north. It was obvious that the other party was trying to scare him, using something that didn't exist to deceive him into opening the city gates and letting them enter the territory of the 7 kingdoms. In fact, the conditions King Robert had said before were not just angry words, but also his bottom line. If possible, he would not want to lock up hundreds of thousands of wildlings outside the wall and watch them being killed by the White Walkers. However, if these hundreds of thousands of wildlings were unwilling to submit to the king and lords, unwilling to lay down their weapons and stop plundering, unwilling to pick up farm tools and farm in peace, then, if they were put into the wall like this, it would be a disaster. Robert could not agree, and the north, which was the most directly affected by the wildlings, would not agree even more. Eddard Stark sat on the side seat, looking at the wildling envoys below with a frosty face. Chapter 266, Allied Forces. As the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jeff Mormont now sat in a seat next to him. His seat had been occupied by King Robert. There were 2 dukes and several earls in front of him. However, Old Mormont was also the Earl of Bear Island before joining the Night's Watch. With his status as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, he had a chair to sit on. He sat next to Stark, the former Duke of Winterfell, and across from him was Stannis Baratheon, the Duke of Dragonstone, the eldest brother of King Robert. He had broad shoulders and a tall figure. His skin had become darker and harder than iron due to long-term exposure to the sun. Although Stannis was not very old now, not much different from John Connington, he looked a little prematurely aged. Only a row of fine black hair remained on his head, like the shadow of a crown. His face was firm, his eyes were deep, his lips were pale, thin and tight. He sat beside his brother Robert and watched the wildling messengers being driven away again. He was serious and had a thoughtful look on his face. We should really treat these lawless wildlings with a high pressure attitude, otherwise who knows what kind of chaos they will cause. After entering the wall, Stannis said in a stiff tone. Like Robert and Eddard, he was extremely annoyed with these wildlings who called themselves free people, because their freedom was built on the suffering of others. They did not engage in production, but liked to plunder. They called such behavior freedom. They even mocked the people of the Seven Kingdoms who worked hard and honestly to support themselves and their families as kneeling people. If Stannis were to follow his temper, these people would not even be qualified to wear black clothes. They should freeze to death in the cold wind outside the wall, or be killed by those terrifying White Walkers. Although the two brothers Robert and Stannis often disagreed on many things, it was rare for Stannis not to quarrel with his brother on this matter. However, there was one more thing. Is the Horn of Winter really something that does not exist? Stannis raised his head and asked. He was still a little worried. He heard the wildling's voice speak with certainty in details, and it seemed that there was such a thing, and he was a little confused. Humph, the builder Brandon built the Great Wall with great effort. Why did he leave behind such a sacred weapon that can destroy the Great Wall? Robert, who was sitting in the main seat, took another sip of the wine in the glass. His face flushed and waved his hand in disapproval. If there really is such a thing, why didn't the wildlings blow it earlier? If the Great Wall collapsed, they wouldn't have to continue to suffer in such a bitter and cold place. Robert's words were reasonable. Stannis just shook his head when he heard it. He was just a little suspicious just now, but now it seems that the wildlings are really desperate to try to scare them. At this time, sitting at the back of the meeting room, the Night's Watch Mr. Eamon stood up tremblingly and spoke. The Horn of Winter is not something that does not exist. My Lord Zan, Your Majesty. The old man had a few messy white hairs on his bald head, a pair of white blind eyes, and a hoarse voice. Although Eamon faced the enemy who destroyed his family, he was still able to deal with it calmly, and even called the other party Your Majesty. Eddard, who was sitting next to King Robert, raised his head when he saw Mr. Eamon suddenly speak, and his eyes were slightly condensed. He was one of the few people who knew the true identity of Mr. Eamon, but he was not worried that Robert would kill this nearly 100-year-old man. Robert should not be such a person. After all, Mr. Eamon was Robert's great-grandfather. I don't know why Eddard suddenly lost his confidence in the end. The relationship was too complicated, and he couldn't figure out how Robert should address such an old man for a while. But he thought of the mother and son who died tragically in King's Landing, and suddenly he didn't seem to trust his good brother so much. At that time, he even had a big quarrel with Robert because of this. Then he led his troops to leave King's Landing alone, and went south to lift the siege of Storm's End. He also went to Dawn to bring back his sister's body. Oh. Mr. Eamon suddenly spoke, naturally attracting the attention of everyone present. This time, King Robert led a coalition of nobles from the Seven Kingdoms, not only Stannis and Eddard Stark. There was also Lord Jon Royce of Runestone from the Vale, who led the army of the Vale. Lord Lefford of the Golden Tooth from the Westerlands, led the army of the Westerlands. Tywin Lannister's brothers were all dead, and he didn't want to come to the cold and frozen wall, so he could only hand over the mediocre Lord of the Golden Tooth to lead the army. There was also Lord Blackfish of the Riverlands, Brynden Tully, Dawn, the Reach, the Stormlands, etc. Except for the Iron Islands. However, Dawn had the least people, only 300 people, and it didn't look like they were here to fight, but more like they were here to travel to the end of the world. Now everyone's eyes fell on the white-haired old man. They didn't know the other party's identity as a Targaryen, and his once silver hair had now turned pale. Who is this? Said Lord Jon Royce of Runestone City with a puzzled look on his face. He didn't know this old man, but he seemed to be a Night's Watchman, and a Night's Watchman who could sit here was naturally of extraordinary status, and the other party was really old. Lord Jon asked in a more polite tone. This is Mr. Eamon of the Night's Watch. At this time, the commander-in-chief of the Night's Watch, Old Mormont, helped Mr. Eamon out of the siege and explained. Mr. Eamon has served on the wall for decades and is already 93 years old this year. He is knowledgeable and has read almost all the books left by the Night's Watch. Many of the precious books left by the Night's Watch in the past generations are rare copies that are not included in the Citadel, so Mr. Eamon often writes to the Citadel to discuss some issues. Oh, it's Mr. Eamon. Hearing that the old man in front of them was already 93 years old, everyone present was shocked. At this age, he was almost a living fossil. They had never heard of anyone living to such an old age. No matter how brilliant or powerful you were when you were young, you would find out in the end that living a long life is the truth. Earl Lefford also showed a shocked expression and then asked, "What about this old man? You just said that the Horn of Winter is not a non-existent thing. What does that mean?" Chapter 267 Renus and Regal. The Horn of Winter, also known as Jomun's Horn, is a legendary magic item. There are several legends about its origin, but the most credible one is that it was left by Brandon the Builder, according to the records in the Night's Watch Chronicles. Then the white-haired Mr. Eamon explained tremblingly. He explained in detail the records about the Horn of Winter. 4,000 years ago, Jomun, the king beyond the wall, had found and blew this legendary magic item. However, after his death, this magic item also disappeared. Until now, 4,000 years later, the new king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, claimed that he had also found the Horn of Winter. There are many ancient books stored in Castle Black to prove the existence of the Horn of Winter, so it is certain that it should exist. However, whether Mance Rayder really found the Horn of Winter is still in doubt. After Mr. Eamon's words fell, King Robert, the Duke of Winterfell, Stannis, and others in the meeting hall of Castle Black looked at each other in bewilderment. Since the Horn of Winter really exists, then, what if what the king beyond the wall said was not a lie? He really found the Horn of Winter. Far away at the wall, the negotiation process between the wildlings and the coalition forces became a little difficult. And on the other side of the sea, in Andalus, crash, flags fluttered. Soldiers wearing red and black armor with the Targaryen three-headed dragon emblem were marching in a column on the road, winding for a long distance, and divided into rectangular arrays. They were stationed in the desolate mountain camp on the ancient road leading to the mountains of Norvus east of Andalus. The 2nd Legion of the Targaryen family, led by Prince Oberyn of Dorne, was now heading to Engelhart for support along the Upper Oin River. The army was marching slowly with heavy steps. Tap tap tap. At this moment, the sound of horse hooves rang out. A man wearing sandy yellow soft armor sat on a war horse with pure black hair, and there was a golden spear with a sun-piercing emblem on his chest. The war horse ran actively along the Upper Oin River, the horse's hooves kicked up the soil, and the man's black curly hair fluttered in the wind. His deep eyes narrowed slightly, and looked into the distance, then reined in the war horse. Whoa, Oberyn rode his horse halfway up the hillside, stroking the horse's hooves a few times, and turning his head to look behind. The long army was moving slowly forward. Then, following behind him, another knight wearing black armor and holding a double-edged axe rode to Oberyn's side. Prince Oberyn. The sunlight above his head was a little dazzling. Although it was winter now, the sunlight on the Anne's plain was still very strong. Oberyn narrowed his eyes slightly, put his hands on the pergola to block the sunlight, and then turned his head to look at the black-armored knight. Lord Evanberth. Oberyn's eyes were deep, his gaze was calm and indifferent with a little scrutiny. He held the reins with one hand, raised his chin slightly and said, "I said that in the Legion. You should still call me the Legion Commander, not my title." Oberyn deeply implemented Viserys' military reform. He was an active supporter of this policy. Oberyn felt that Viserys' reform was indeed very good and could effectively improve the combat effectiveness and enthusiasm of the army. Because Viserys' military reform was not to judge heroes by their origins, he took the initiative to tear open a little bit of this gap, but did not tear it off completely. In the current Targaryen army, as long as they have made military achievements, any civilians, even soldiers who were born as slaves and served on behalf of their masters, have the opportunity to get land or become knights. And the army does not judge the rank of officials by their titles. As the Prince of Dorne, Oberyn's status has reached the pinnacle of the nobility. Everyone thought he would oppose this reform, but unexpectedly, he was an active supporter of this reform. Because with a barren smart mind, he understood the benefits of reform to the country. If history has always been a wheel rolling forward, it starts from one point and then turns around and returns to the starting point, repeating over and over again. The appearance of Viserys gave a barren hope of breaking this wheel of history. Therefore, smart people like him will follow Viserys wholeheartedly, wanting to help him achieve this great goal. Sorry, my lord. When the black-armored Earl Avon heard Oberyn's words, a trace of shame appeared on his cheek under the helmet, and he hurriedly apologized. Avon Perth was the first Royner noble to join Viserys. Because of the effect of buying bones with 1,000 gold coins and Avon's bravery in battle, he was rewarded with a rich town. Because of the reform of the nobles of the new dynasty, the real power in the hands of an earl is not very heavy. The real difference between Avon Perth and other earls of the new dynasty is the military power in his hands. Earl Avon Perth is a deputy commander of the 2nd Legion and holds great power. However, Viserys originally wanted to place a confidant to check Oberyn's power. The dispute between the chief and the deputy has always existed since ancient times. However, Viserys did not expect that Avon Perth was no match for Oberyn in terms of tactics, and was suppressed in a few moves. Now this deputy legion commander of Earl Perth is completely powerless, and cannot check Oberyn's power at all. Instead, he has become a tool for the other party. Have the logistics supplies been arranged? Oberyn just ordered Avon Perth to keep an eye on the progress of the baggage carts in the rear. After all, baggage is the most important thing for the army to march. If the baggage is attacked, I'm afraid that these thousands of people will be in danger. It has been arranged, Lord Legionnaire. Earl Avon nodded and agreed. While the 2 legion leaders on the ground were communicating, a black shadow shrouded their heads. Then it spread its wings and flew into the distance along the direction of the army. Dragon. Oberyn raised his head and looked at the sky. The huge black shadow that fell from the sky was of course a dragon, but the size of this dragon was far different from that of Balerion, almost 3 times the size. Balerion was now 17 or 18 meters long, close to 20 meters long, while this dragon was only 6 or 7 meters long. He was like a little brother who had not grown up in front of Balerion, but for humans or war horses, he was still a rapidly growing behemoth, changing almost every day. Regal. Rhaenys rode on the back of the green dragon Regal, galloping in the blue sky. Her long brown hair fluttered in the wind, and her beautiful face showed no fear at all, but excitement instead. Since Regal was taught a lesson by Balerion, he has become much more obedient. In order to allow his niece to ride the dragon smoothly and safely, Oberyn commissioned craftsmen to tailor a harness with a high safety factor that could fix Rhaenys well. Then Rhaenys rode the dragon for the first time. She was going to follow her uncle on an expedition to break the siege of the Castle of Souls. The geographical location of the Castle of Souls is extremely important. If it is lost, the Andalus Plain behind it will be an empty area of the Andalus Plain. Viserys handed the city to her before leaving Andalus, and Rhaenys would never let it be harmed. However, at this moment, Rhaenys, riding on the back of Regal, narrowed her beautiful eyes slightly, and she seemed to suddenly see a black dot from a distance. Huh? What is that? Chapter 268, Rebellion in Pentos. Not far from here is the Castle of Hell, the former Gordoha area. This is a castle built on a ruined city, with 10,000 Targaryen soldiers stationed. The war here is relatively calm now. Since the arrival of the Dothraki, they have been desperately attacking the city in the past 2 days, and both sides have left many corpses. However, the Dothraki suddenly stopped the pace of attacking the city, and became provocative every day. And according to observation, the Dothraki camped behind the back, and were building siege weapons such as catapults, giant crossbows, and ladders. There are not many craftsmen among the Dothraki, and they rarely build such siege weapons. It is obvious that the Dothraki have the support of other free trade cities behind them. They not only blocked the Bay of Pentos, but also helped the Dothraki build siege weapons. And these horse-riding warriors are not stupid. It is obvious that they suffered losses in the siege some time ago, and they know to listen to people's advice, and eat a full meal, and wait until the siege weapons are built, before attacking the city. The Castle of Hell was just a half-finished castle that had not yet been completed. Once the siege weapons were built, it would not be difficult to knock on its door. Therefore, the Dothraki did not attack the city these days, but came to the city every day to provoke. And no one in the Targaryen castle and military camp responded from beginning to end, like a turtle shrinking its head, which made the Dothraki people more and more courageous. They believed that these lambs only hid in the stone house to block the Dothraki warriors. If they dared to come out, they would be killed and abandon their armor. Then the Dothraki provocations became more and more bold, and even came to a position very close to the military camp. Then this seemed to anger the Targaryen soldiers in the military camp, and finally a knight who had undergone rigorous training, could not bear it anymore. "Give me the bow and arrow." He took the soldier's bow and arrow, and pulled it open. With a bang, the bowstring made a sound. The aim was very accurate, and the arrow shot the daring Dothraki to death. The rest of the Dothraki who came to provoke and insult saw this scene, and hurriedly fled back, and then continued to provoke from a slightly farther distance than before. They calculated that this was a place in the camp that could not be reached by bows and arrows. However, this time the commander of the Targaryen army seemed to have been really angered by the Dothraki. This time, the gates of the castle and the camp suddenly opened at the same time, and a large number of Targaryen soldiers poured out directly. The Dothraki scouts seemed to be unable to react in time, and were shot, and fell off their horses. Only a few people lay on the backs of their horses with 2 arrows stuck in their bodies, and fled back to their camp. The lamb hiding in the stone house actually has the courage to come out. In the middle of the Dothraki camp is a huge animal skin tent. Although it looks a bit simple, it is indeed sitting in it. Kalziko and Kalmoro. Kalziko's LS is stronger, so he sits in the main seat, while Kalmoro's LS is slightly weaker, so he sits in the seat next to him. Now the two are listening to the tribesmen reporting the news from Pentus. The appearance of the dragon brought great obstacles to the army's attack. The 3 Khals jointly commanded 50,000 Dothraki warriors and a large number of vassal troops, but they suffered heavy casualties, but did not shake the mighty city of Pentus. In the end, it was the Bravos who helped and contacted some insiders hiding in Pentus. They seemed to be Pentus people who had been associated with the Bloody Knight. They hated the current tattered prince and the Targaryen family who destroyed everything for them, and hoped that Dothraki friends could help them restore the glory of their family. Therefore, one night, they quietly gathered a group of people, and at the same time, hired many mercenaries to suddenly riot in the city of Pentus, as if they wanted to seize the city gate and let the Dothraki army outside the city rush into the city. The scene at that time was very dangerous. The Dothraki had already received the signal, so they rushed in like a rising tide. The gate of Pentus was also opened in the chaos, and the two sides started a fierce battle at the gate. Finally, the dragon arrived. Balerion burned the Dothraki's retreat with dragon flames, blocking their endless reinforcement outside the city gate. The Dothraki who had rushed into Pentus became rootless. Although they still fought fiercely, they were eventually wiped out one by one. Although this plan to capture the city with internal and external forces ended in failure, it was still good news worth cheering up. After all, they were just one step away from taking over the city of Pentus. However, what puzzled Kalziko and Kalmoro was their description of the Black Dragon. In the intelligence they heard, the Black Dragon was almost described as a god on par with the Great Horse God. Impossible. How old is the Black Dragon now? They couldn't imagine that something could grow to a size of more than 10 meters in just 1.5 years. You know, their brave Dothraki had just learned to walk when they were 1.5 years old. It must be that old jerk Motho who lost the battle and is unwilling to admit it. The two Khals looked at each other and determined that this was the truth. The Dothraki were not harmonious internally, and they only pretended to be friendly in the holy city. However, although conflicts were not allowed in the holy city, there were still many people who were beaten to death by fists and stones in the corners of the holy city streets every year. But at this moment, crash. The curtain of the animal hide tent was suddenly opened, and a blood guard of Kalziko strode in. Blood of my blood. Then he told him what happened outside. The Targaryen army, which had been hiding in the city walls and military camps, seemed to be enraged, and suddenly chased out. They killed all the provocative tribesmen, formed a battle array outside, and wanted to fight the Dothraki fiercely. The lamb hiding in the stone house actually has the courage to come out. Time went back to the beginning. The two cows who were listening to the intelligence from Pentis looked at each other when they heard the news brought by the blood guards and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. Then they were overjoyed. Ha ha ha, since these lambs dare to come out, they should not go back. The Dothraki warriors will harvest their souls and offer them to the great horse god. Kalziko was overjoyed and immediately prepared to send people to kill all the tin men. However, Khal Moro, who was sitting next to him, frowned slightly, feeling that something was wrong. How could these lambs have the courage to abandon their stone houses and come out to fight the brave Dothraki warriors? However, although he had some doubts, he could not find the doubts. He could only follow Kalziko and walk out together. Chapter 269. Success or failure depends on this move. The Targaryen army assembled outside the military camp, with three-headed dragon flags fluttering in the wind. The soldiers lined up neatly, their helmets and armor shining, and shouted loud slogans. Who? Who? In the distance, the Dothraki gradually walked out of the simple camp. The Dothraki camp was extremely simple, without even wooden walls. There were only some animal skin tents, and some pits dug on the ground to make fires. Many Dothraki didn't even have tents, but just covered a straw mat and slept on the ground. However, sleeping like this was okay during the long summer, but now that winter has arrived, although it is not that cold here in Goldoho, the temperature has still dropped sharply. This place is at a higher latitude than the warm Dothraki Sea. Therefore, ordinary Dothraki people are not so comfortable. Although they are not frozen to death, many of them have caught colds and are sick. They can only move their bodies more every day and put on more clothes in the hope of being warmer. However, no one expected that the Targaryen army, which had been hiding in the castle, would suddenly take the initiative to issue a declaration of war and line up outside the city to fight to the death. Many Dothraki who had received the order from the Khal were confused. Are these lambs' brains broken? They could only understand it this way. Then the Dothraki army gathered. For this barbaric race, their tactics were to burn, kill and rob. After all, few armies could withstand the attack of the Dothraki in the field. Often, the enemy's morale collapsed after just one round of charge. The soldiers fled in a panic and their formations were in chaos. Then, they were ruthlessly harvested by the Dothraki like cutting leeks. This group of tearing lambs. The tall Kalziko rode a tall horse and stood in the front. He seemed not afraid of the cold at all. His upper body was naked, and his body was covered with dark tattoos. His deep eyes looked at the Targaryen army lined up outside the city in the distance. Kalziko was not a fool to become the leader. He knew that the other party was trying to lure him to attack, and perhaps he had some plan. However, Kalziko had sufficient confidence in his people. He would go to Koha for a sweep every 4 or 5 years. Although Koha had successfully fought against the Dothraki before, that was more than 400 years ago. Now Kalziko's army would obediently offer gold when they arrived at Koha. He knew that the other party was plotting something, but Kalziko didn't care. He believed that his KLS would be able to defeat them directly. Then Kalziko sat on his warhorse and pulled out the gilded scimitar at his waist and gave the order to charge. Oharat. The next second, the endless Dothraki let out a howl like a tsunami and rushed towards the Targaryen army in the distance. And surrounded by the army in the distance, the Legion commander wearing a bright silver armor held the reins with one hand, and his posture on horseback was also a little weird. He wore a metal mask on his face, and his whole body was covered in steel. Only the tiny gap between the mask and his neck could reveal his skin. It was a shocking sight. His skin was all burnt and even rotten, like a ghost that had walked out of a sea of fire, but his eyes were still bright and sharp. Bessie Joyce looked at the Dothraki who were aggressive in the distance, and then raised her hand. She sounded a little weak, but her words were full of determination. Raise your shields, and prepare for battle. His messenger looked stern and hurriedly passed down the order. Raise your shields. Raise your shields. A grassroots commander of the Legion, wearing bright armor, and riding on a warhorse, shouted loudly. Raise your shields, boys. Ha, ha, crash. In an instant, countless shields with three-headed fire dragon emblems were raised, and long spears were placed in the gaps between the shields. The soldiers held the guns tightly in their hands, their throats rolled slightly, and their palms were full of sweat. This kind of spear and shield formation is the most basic formation in the Targaryen army, mainly to counter the cavalry's charge. Bassi led the 1st Legion to station here for more than a year. In addition to seizing the time to build the castle, he also practiced the formation. What's more, many of the more than 10,000 soldiers he led now were Andal warriors who participated in the Battle of Goldohol on this land. It didn't take too long to assemble a spear formation, and the black mass of Dothraki in the distance was rushing like a tide. 10,000 horses galloped on the land, and the ground under the feet of the Targaryen soldiers was shaking slightly. The invincible momentum overwhelmed them. Is this the Dothraki? Many of the Targaryen soldiers had never seen such a scene, and they had already begun to retreat psychologically. This is the skill that the Dothraki rely on to survive. They are scared to death before the battle even starts, and their morale becomes extremely low. After that, they can't stand the pressure and flee in all directions after a slight attack. This is why Jon Connington tried his best to stop Viserys from going out of the city to fight the Dothraki. If Viserys led an elite force, it would be fine, but the scumbags like the Pentos garrison have no way to resist such a formation. I'm afraid there will be deserters before the battle even starts, and the collapse of the battle line is often an avalanche-like disaster, which is likely to affect everyone, and eventually turn into a rout. Archers, hold on. Gather the troops. One command after another came from Bess's mouth, and the grassroots commanders rode their war horses and ran in the back, shouting loudly at the same time. There's nothing to be afraid of these damn bastards. In the battle formation with spears, an old Targaryen soldier who once followed Viserys proudly spoke to the new recruits beside him who had never seen such a battle. I once killed 3 Dothraki myself. Really? The pale recruit, who was listening to the sound of horse hooves approaching from afar, looked better after hearing the words of the veteran. Then he heard the voice of their general. Archers, hurry up. Me sat upright on his warhorse, holding the reins tightly in his hands, and felt a little tingling in his scalp as he looked at the overwhelming Dothraki in the distance. However, he did not show his fear on his face, because too many people were watching his expression. Then Me turned his head and looked at his good friend. Fighting outside the city was a very risky move. Me once privately persuaded Bessie to change this idea. The two boys came from the same Andal village and were the first to join Andalus. However, their fates were different. Bessie, who was calm and brave since childhood, and was even selected as the son of a warrior by the village, was selected to become Viserys' Kingsguard after coming to Andalus. Later, he was appointed to lead troops outside and eventually became one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Me had been struggling in the army. Fortunately, both boys had a good fate. They survived ups and downs and lived to this day, and each of them achieved success. Now, success or failure depends on this one move. Chapter 270 Fierce Battle. Hold the formation. Don't panic. Facing the aggressive Dothraki, the soldiers at the forefront were the elite of the Legion. However, even they felt nervous at this time. Their breathing became rapid, and they held their weapons tightly. The Legion commander, who was surrounded by countless soldiers, was still calm and commanded. Calm down. The 7 gods will bless us. Warriors give us courage and strength. His words calmed many panicked soldiers. Although faith is invisible, it also has great power in war, which can make soldiers facing desperate situations burst out their last courage. Archers, get ready. Then Bessie raised her hand, and her palm with steel gloves reflected the light of metal in the morning sun. Draw your bow. Draw your bow. The captain of the Legion rode a warhorse and galloped in the back, shouting loudly. In the Targaryen Legion, every 200 people are a team, and every 5 teams are a 1,000-man general. There are more grassroots commanders below. The command system is perfect, and the commander's orders are conveyed very quickly. In front of them was a strong formation of spears and shields, and in the back were densely packed archers. They had no way to retreat with their backs against the city wall, but they were also not in danger. They didn't have to worry about the Dothraki coming around and attacking them from the back. Therefore, the Targaryen army still occupied an advantageous terrain, and the castle was located at a slightly higher position on the battlefield. Click, all the archers drew their bows and arrows upon hearing the order, pulled the bowstrings, and made a teeth-grinding sound, and aimed at the sky in front of them at an angle. Then a few seconds passed. Boom. 10,000 horses galloping. The vanguard of the Dothraki had already entered the range of the Targaryen army's arrows, and then an order was given. Shoot, shoot, shoot. Bang, the bowstrings made a sound, and a black rain of arrows flew straight into the sky, and then fell down at the highest point. It was like a rainstorm, but the raindrops were all sharp metal arrows, hitting the Dothraki's face. Puff, 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 the sound of dense metal piercing flesh and blood. Soon the rain of arrows fell, and set off a blood flower among the Dothraki. Countless Dothraki who were riding on horseback, and swinging scimitars were shot, and fell off their horses. Their bodies fell to the ground, and then they were trampled into meat paste by the tribesmen behind them. In an instant, blood and flesh flew everywhere. However, what made people desperate was that the Dothraki did not change their faces in the face of such casualties. On the contrary, because of the stimulation of blood, their ferocity was aroused, and they rushed over more fearlessly. Keep the formation. Boys, keep the formation. Me held the reins tightly in his hand and commanded loudly. The attack of the bows and arrows did not stop the Dothraki from advancing, and the next step was to test his soldiers. As a general in the legion, he had more than 1,000 soldiers under his command. However, he was not a general, because his friend was the legion commander. Mer also participated in the great battle on the land under his feet. At that time, he was still a captain, leading his brothers to arrange fortifications, and made great contributions. In addition, in the subsequent wars, he made several contributions in logistics and supply dispatch and pre-war command, and finally became a general. However, the Dothraki's charge did not stop at all. After 2 rounds of volleys, they arrived in front of the Targaryen legion in the blink of an eye. All the soldiers subconsciously held their spears tightly, and the soldiers hiding behind the shields also tightened their muscles, trying to resist the coming impact. Boom. The next second, the Dothraki's horses directly hit the Targaryen army's spear formation, and the indestructible spear formation instantly shook, and under great pressure, the Dothraki were also thrown to the ground. The horses neighed in pain, and the soldiers who were knocked down also screamed. Kill. Countless soldiers holding spears hid behind their shields, and stabbed out with their weapons tightly. They hardly needed to use their eyes to see, just thrusting in and pulling out, and then thrusting in, and pulling out again. Blood spurted in through the gaps in the shields, and everyone's eyes were red with killing. Kill. Kill all these bastards. However, not all places in the army array withstood this first wave of impact. The heavy bodies of the charging horses carried a strong impact force and directly hit the spear array, and some weak places were instantly opened. With the flaws, the power of the spear array dropped by more than 1 level. In an instant, countless Dothraki rushed into the places with flaws. Puff puff, the shield array was broken, and the soldiers fell to the ground. The scimitars of the Dothraki mercilessly harvested their lives. Not good. As a general, me gritted his teeth when he saw this scene, and then drew his long sword from his waist. Hold on. Keep the formation. Then he rushed forward, wanting to personally go into battle to stabilize the formation. However, not far away, sitting on a pure white warhorse without a single stray hair, the commander of the legion, Bessie Joyce, pulled the reins, and the eyes under the mask were calmly looking at the chaotic battlefield in front of him. There was more than one loophole. The Dothraki people were fearless and used their lives to break through bloody paths in the army. The indestructible front of the Targaryen had begun to show some signs of collapse, but this was not his fault. There were not many armies that could withstand the attack of the Dothraki people in the wild. Although the army he led had firm beliefs, it was not like the Unsullied, who would not hesitate, even if they committed suicide. If he was given a few more years, perhaps he would be able to lead such an army with firm beliefs. But it was useless to say that now. Bessie looked up at the sky. The sky was cloudless in the early morning, with only a few birds flying overhead. It's not time yet. Then he retracted his gaze, and continued to look at the battlefield not far away, while the guards beside him were a little nervous. Commander-in-Chief, it's too dangerous here. You should retreat to the castle. Although the situation on the front line is currently tense, it has not collapsed immediately, which shows that the soldiers of the Legion are already elite enough. However, the Legion is weak, and the Dothraki are still pouring in. After all, the opponent has more numbers. However, Bessie ignored the words of the guards beside him, but pondered for a moment, and played a card. Let the cavalry go and cut the battlefield from the flank. Now the Dothraki rushed in to attack the array head on. Because of the trenches and walls on both sides, they had no way to go around to attack the two sides of the array or to attack from behind. If they could do that, I'm afraid these Targaryen troops would collapse faster, and they could only form a circle to deal with it. This is the inherent advantage of cavalry over infantry. Now the Targaryen army, with its back against the city wall, almost replicated the conditions of the Battle of Koha with 3,000 warriors. However, the only difference is that the Targaryen army is not the indestructible Unsullied. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 271 Reinforcement arrive. Draw your bow. Release. On the chaotic battlefield, the front line shakily withstood the first wave of pressure, and the archers in the rear continued to shoot arrows. Another round of arrow rain came. Dense arrows flew into the sky and then fell on the highest point. The Targaryen army was well equipped and used arrows with barbs. This kind of arrow is best at dealing with unarmored soldiers like the Dothraki. Once it pierces the flesh, you have to dig out a piece of flesh to pull it out, and most of the arrows have been stained with gold juice or poisonous water ground from poisonous grass. With the current medical conditions of the Dothraki, being shot by an arrow is almost a 100% death, and it is difficult to be rescued. The overwhelming rain of arrows once again fell into the endless Dothraki in the rear. Puff puff puff, another group of Dothraki warriors who were shaking their scimitars and howling were shot and fell off their horses and then were trampled into meat paste. However, the Dothraki also launched a counterattack. As a nation on horseback, the Dothraki are best at scimitars, bows and arrows, and long whips. A blood guard of Kalziko in the front whistled sharply, and then countless Dothraki following him took off their short bows from their backs. Then he clamped his legs around the horse's belly and relied on his strong core strength to stabilize his body on the galloping warhorse. Then he drew his bow and put an arrow on it. Bang, bang, bang. A black rain of arrows flew over, and the Dothraki began to fight back. The bows and arrows directly bypassed the battlefield in front of the melee and fell to the back of the Targaryen army behind the army. Raise your shield. Raise your shield. The generals and captains in the legion all changed their expressions and then ordered the shield bearers in the back to raise their shields above their heads to block this wave of arrows. Then a dense rain of arrows fell and hit the shields, making a crackling sound. However, there were still many arrows that were not able to dodge or penetrated through the gaps in the shields, hitting the Targaryen soldiers. Ah! A scream was heard immediately. The war was still developing. Abandon the first line of defense. Let the reserve troops go up. Bessie calmly examined the battlefield and issued commands intensively. Retreat. Retreat quickly. Retreat to the second line of defense. Let the reserve troops go up. The generals under his command firmly obeyed the orders of the legion commander. The fighting on the front line was still going on. The soldiers in the melee might not know it, but the front line was retreating step by step. Countless war horses continued to hit the shields. No matter how hard the shield formation was, it would eventually collapse. The wooden pole in the hand of a soldier holding a spear was broken. Go to hell. Then he drew the long sword at his waist and rushed forward with red eyes, stabbing the fallen enemy in front of him to death with one sword and cutting off his head. However, a Dothraki jumped off his horse and fell on him, howling, and then cut his throat. Puff, blood gushed out, but he still held the other's wrist tightly and did not let go. The battle on the front line was extremely tragic, and everyone was bloodshot. At this time, the gates on both sides of the castle were wide open, and the two teams of knights wearing bright plate armor even covered their horses with armor, holding long spears under their armpits, then exchanged glances with each other, and then urged their horses to go to the battlefield in the distance. They were a card played by Bessie in this situation. Charge. Follow the order of the legion commander and cut the battlefield. For the heavy cavalry, the first priority is not to get stuck in the battlefield. However, the battlefield is so large now Although the heavy cavalry's charge is powerful and cuts into the battlefield from the side, it is still very difficult for both sides to complete the battlefield. If they are not careful, they will all be stuck in it. That would be a disaster for this team of knights. However, the duty of the soldiers is to obey orders, and they still have great trust in their legion commander. Then the two teams of cavalry appeared on the side of the battlefield and rushed towards the battlefield. Rumble, the horses galloped, and the momentum was fierce. In the distance, seeing the appearance of the two teams of heavy cavalry, Zuko finally smiled. Is this the method of the dragon riding Cal? He knew that the other party had ideas, but Zuko was confident in his own strength. However, he did not expect that, after waiting for a long time, the other party's method seemed to be some tactical changes on the battlefield. Nothing new. He was also wary of the loss suffered by Drogo Cal before, to prevent the other party from suddenly playing some fire attack. There were even some giant crossbows hidden behind him. He thought that the other party's dragon would come to support and then give a head-on blow, but he did not expect nothing. That Viserys is not here. He is still trapped in Pentus. And Moro Cal beside him shook his head and said, Cal the dragon is a name that the Dothraki people call Viserys, just like they call the Prince of Pentus who rides in a carriage Cal the cripple. Cal means king in Dothraki. Can a dragon fly here in one day? You are too careful, Cal Jiko. The intelligence they received not long ago indicated that Viserys and his dragon should still be in Pentus, and even just dealt with a rebellion. At that time, the city gates were wide open, and Dothraki warriors had already poured in. If it weren't for his dragon, Pentus would probably have fallen. This was the flaw in their intelligence. Although they had the help of the Bravos, they were still slow in intelligence. Then Cal Jiko no longer hesitated, and with a wave of his hand, he pressed forward with his entire army. Just now, he had already made the Targaryen army breathless, and now the entire army was pressing forward, which was equivalent to swallowing them in one bite, not giving them the opportunity to escape back to the castle. Otherwise, it would be another headache for Cal Jiko. However, as long as this castle is conquered, the next step is the Andus Plain, which is flat and unobstructed. That is where the Dothraki warriors can perform. They have no pressure, burning, killing, looting, and dividing the Targaryen feast. With the order of Cal Jiko, countless Dothraki who have been ready for a long time howled excitedly, and then urged their horses to rush to the battlefield in the distance. At this time, the entire Dothraki army pressed forward. From the side of the battlefield, in the direction of the Rhoyne River, a small black dot first appeared on the distant horizon, and then a long black line appeared on the horizon. Ho! The green dragon Regal roared, and the eldest princess of the new dynasty, Rhaenys, sat on the dragon's back, wearing a small armor. Her hands tightly grasped the saddle in front of her, and the strong wind blew the girl's long brown hair, and then dived down to the position of Cal Jiko below. I found you. Rhaenys' dark eyes showed excitement. Her luck was better than Viserys's. She saw the Cal giving orders in the crowd at a glance, and knew that he was the leader of the Dothraki. This was also the task assigned to her by her uncle Oberyn. Dracarys. Rhaenys bit her white teeth slightly, and spoke softly in High Valyrian. Boom. The next second, a huge flame fell to the earth. Chapter 272. A great victory. A great battle was breaking out on the battlefield of Hellfire. Bessie sacrificed her soldiers' lives to lure the Dothraki into the trap, but just when all the Dothraki were deeply trapped on the battlefield, Oberyn's reinforcement arrived in time. Princess Rhaenys of Targaryen rode a giant dragon to lead the army. The young girl made great contributions on her first battlefield. Regal drowned the Tikals below with a breath of dragon flame. Cal Jiko and Cal Moro never thought that they would be the first to die in the battle, even though they were hiding at the back of the team. The enemy fell from the sky and burned themselves to death. His well-prepared giant crossbow lost its effect before it even had time to exert its power. Boom. The surging dragon flame spewed onto the ground, and Cal Jiko and Cal Moro opened their horrified eyes, and then were drowned in the sea of fire without a sound. Then the dragon roared, shook its wings, and flew into the sky again. Although Regal's stature was far smaller than that of Valyrian, he was still a huge beast in front of the tiny humans on the ground, and was a terrifying natural enemy at the top of the food chain for war horses. At this time, a huge figure also appeared in the sky to the south of the battlefield. Viserys rode on Balerian's back and flew above the clouds, slightly squinting his lavender eyes and looking at the battlefield on the ground in the distance. He didn't expect that he was late. What he didn't expect was that the figure dancing in the billowing smoke was spewing dragon flames from time to time. Rhaenys? Rhaenys dared to ride a dragon to the battlefield by herself. Viserys' heart suddenly rose slightly, and then he was a little surprised and angry. Riding a dragon does not mean that it is completely infallible. The spear shot from the giant crossbow can still pose a threat to the dragon, especially an underage dragon like Regal. Even Balerion, who wasn't a Viserys crotch, was still an underage dragon, but it grew a little faster with the help of the black fog. The dragon riders were even more dangerous. This little girl Viserys gritted his teeth slightly, feeling a little angry, because he loved Rhaenys very much. She was his family. However, perhaps he had returned to Andalus on a dragon not long ago, inspiring the girl's yearning for the sky, so the daring girl actually hid it from him and rode a dragon to fight. It seems that someone was backing her up to give her such confidence. Humph, a baron. Then Balerion roared and dived towards the battlefield on the ground. When Regal, who was wreaking havoc on the battlefield, heard the roar from above his head, he shuddered all over and flapped his wings twice, almost falling directly from the sky. The threat of his elder brother was almost a shadow of his childhood. Rhaenys on Regal's back was also startled. She had just focused all her attention on the fire below and didn't notice the arrival of Viserys above her head. Is Viserys here? Rhaenys suddenly felt a little guilty. And on the battlefield. Who? The Dothraki were very superstitious. They would give mystery to things they could not explain. They called dragons gods. The dragon riding cow. That's the dragon riding cow. The Dothraki faced a pincer attack from both sides, and two dragons were flying overhead. They instantly became chaotic and kept shouting. Viserys was known as the dragon riding cow by the Dothraki. There is not only the dragon riding cow. There is also the dragon riding cow Khaleesi. The sharp-eyed Dothraki also saw that there was a girl on the back of the slightly petite green dragon. Two dragon riders, two dragons, and a catastrophe. So the battlefield was one-sided. Bessie Joyce survived the difficult initial stage and successfully lured out all the Dothraki troops. He was determined to swallow the 30,000 Dothraki in front of him in one gulp. Therefore, a Baron's support was extremely important, but fortunately, a Baron did not disappoint him and arrived as promised, and the arrival of Viserys and Rhaenys was an unexpected surprise. Your Majesty, and Her Royal Highness. Bessie, who was covered in armor, looked up at the dragons flying in the sky with a touch of admiration in her eyes. He once liked Rhaenys, and he did not hide this. At that time, he was still Viserys' king's good. But unfortunately, Rhaenys did not like him. The girl only had Viserys in her eyes, so Bessie gave up. The gap between their identities was too big. Later, Rhaenys begged him to save Daenerys, and Bessie rushed into the sea of fire without hesitation. He was to save his mother, and also for Rhaenys' request. But later, he became even more miserable. But he did not regret it, because this was a test for him by the seven gods. The Legion commander sighed deeply, put away all his emotions, and then his eyes under the mask condensed slightly, and gave the order to end. Kill all those who haven't surrendered. Kill. Instantly, the Targaryen army rushed forward and completely defeated the remaining Dothraki. Some of the Dothraki who were trapped in the encirclement tried to rush out, but more of them knelt down and surrendered directly. With the death of the cow, they lost their fighting spirit. The cow riding a dragon. The real dragon cow. The Dothraki, who were so numerous that it took several days to catch a pig, did not resist at all in this situation. They knelt on the ground and cut off their whips. Then they raised the scimitar in their hands high above their heads and shouted incomprehensible words. It seemed that they had been completely conquered. Ho! The green dragon Regal also landed on the ground carrying Rhaenys. Chapter 273, Khaleesi of the Dragon Cow. Regal landed. Khaleesi on Dragon Cow. The Dothraki who dropped their weapons and knelt down to surrender shouted at Rhaenys. However, Rhaenys was confused because she didn't understand what they were saying. What are they saying? Rhaenys looked confused because she didn't understand Dothraki. Your Highness. Be careful. Then a guard took the eldest princess who jumped off the dragon's back. Rhaenys was tall compared to girls of the same age. She was wearing bright armor and her long brown hair hung down behind her. She raised her hand slightly to tidy up her hair and put it behind her ears. Holding the helmet she had just taken off, her small leather boots stepped on the soft ground, and she looked a bit heroic. Although Renas commanded Regal to set fire indiscriminately in the air, she still looked a little uncomfortable when she came to the ground and saw the charred corpses all over the ground. A breeze blew and turned them into ashes. At this time, there was a heavy breathing sound from above and the sound of wings flapping. Viserys also landed on the ground riding Balerion. Boom. Balerion's heavy body landed on the ground with a loud noise, and the ground trembled slightly. The Dothraki who had already kneeled on the ground and surrendered saw the huge dragon that had just galloped in the sky falling in front of them. It was even bigger than in the sky, and a look of horror suddenly appeared in their eyes. They mumbled in the obscure Dothraki language, repeating words similar to gods. Viserys also climbed down from the dragon's back. He saw the equipment on Regal and felt a little relieved. The most primitive way of riding a dragon like him was still a little dangerous. But fortunately, he had extraordinary abilities and would not be easily bumped down by the dragon's rolling. Even if he fell down, he could turn into a ball of black mist and climb up again. And looking at Rhaenys who was standing there with a guilty conscience, Viserys' face suddenly became slightly stern. Although he rarely got angry, his serious face still had a bit of majesty. Then he jumped off the dragon's back, and Regal, lying on the side, looked at his elder brother and was a little timid. Balerion's huge head almost hit half of his body. If it wanted to, it could bite Regal to death. Fortunately, although Balerion was just a strict brother, he was not a brother as crazy as the mountain and would not press his brother into the brazier. Now the mountain is still imprisoned in Pentus and has not been executed because since learning that the mountain fell into Viserys' hands, a baron strongly demanded to judge him personally. He would not let this demon die too easily. A baron wanted the mountain to explain all his crimes and the instigators behind him, and to serve as a witness in front of the gods, and finally let him live a life worse than death. Therefore, Gregor Clegane was able to live in prison for more than half a year. Viserys was also wearing armor. He took off his helmet and let his silver hair fall loose, handing it to the soldier beside him. "Your Majesty." Then he came to Rhaenys and looked at her with a sharp gaze. Rhaenys felt even more guilty and even dared not look up at him. "Good morning, Viserys." After a long while, Rhaenys finally mustered up the courage to speak. Her voice was very nice, but now it was as thin as a mosquito's hum. She greeted her tentatively and pretended that nothing had happened. Viserys looked at her but said nothing, and then sighed. "The last time I heard the old maid say that Rhaenys had changed a lot since she presided over a city alone. She became independent and had her own opinions, and her once naughty character had also been restrained a lot, and she looked a little like a young lady." But now Viserys thought that Rhaenys' character had not changed. She was still the little girl who quarreled with him if she was not allowed to leave the city, and Viserys' sigh might have irritated Rhaenys. The girl clenched her fists slightly, then finally raised her head and spoke with slightly red eyes. "Viserys, I heard about the war here. I just want to do my part." Rhaenys' voice was full of grievance. Viserys was also slightly stunned when he heard Rhaenys' words. He thought of what the old maid once said to him. "Her Royal Highness the Princess has always wanted to help you. Is that so?" Viserys lowered his head and looked at the aggrieved girl in front of him with a pair of lavender eyes shining. Then he finally bent down and hugged her in his arms. Hula. The armor of the two people made a sound, and the cold metal touched each other. Viserys' action was very sudden, which made the girl unexpected. "Sorry, Rhaenys." Viserys gently hugged Rhaenys, took a deep breath and spoke. "I blamed you wrongly." Rhaenys wanted to help him, and it was like this from the beginning. It's not that she didn't change, but she didn't become like a lady. Instead, he became more mature, and at the age when he should be playing the most, he lost his immaturity and became stronger. Not far away, Basil, wearing a metal mask and covered in armor, pulled the reins and watched the scene and nodded slightly. Then he retracted his gaze and continued to command the soldiers to clean up the mess. The few Dothraki who were still resisting were being killed one by the Targaryen soldiers who surrounded them, and most of the Dothraki who knew that there was no hope of escape did not fight to the death. After the death of the cow, they seemed to have lost the courage to fight for their lives, and they knelt on the ground waiting to receive the prisoners. These Dothraki seemed to be expressing their submission. "Your Majesty." At this time, an officer standing next to Viserys spoke. They could not understand the Dothraki language, and there was no Dothraki translator here, but they could probably understand it a little by looking at the movements. And Viserys had already released the hug at this moment, and Rhaenys followed him. He looked at the Dothraki who were kneeling on the ground and bowing to the dragon, himself and Rhaenys, and frowned slightly as he listened to their mumbling incomprehensible words. Is there a Dothraki translator? Or is there anyone among them who knows High Valyrian or the common speech? Viserys himself knew two languages. One was the Targaryen's native High Valyrian, and the other was the common speech of Westeros. "I'll find one for you, Your Majesty." The officer standing next to Viserys nodded and agreed immediately, then ran away to find a translator for Viserys. Not long after, a soldier who knew Dothraki was brought to Viserys. "Your Majesty." The soldier knew Dothraki because he had followed the caravan to do business in V's Dothraki. "These Dothraki are expressing their submission to you, calling you Khal who rides the dragon and Khal who is the real dragon." Then the soldier who knew Dothraki secretly glanced at Rhaenys. The girl in front of him was not very old, just a young girl. Moreover, Rhaenys' appearance was extremely outstanding. She inherited the advantages of her parents. She had both the handsomeness of Targaryen and some exotic charm of Dawn, which made the young men in the barracks unable to help but peek at her. But they all knew Rhaenys' identity. Although she did not have the iconic silver hair of Targaryen, the girl came riding a dragon, and there was a dragon head medal on her chest, which was enough to show her identity as a dragon family. They also called her Royal Highness the Princess Khaleesi of the Real Dragon. Chapter 274 Surrender. Khal the Dragon? Khaleesi of Khal the Dragon? Viserys was slightly stunned when he heard the Dothraki name from the translator. He didn't expect the Dothraki to call him that, and what he didn't expect was that Viserys glanced at Rhaenys, who was standing beside him in thin armor and looked heroic. The brown-haired girl didn't understand what Khaleesi meant in the Dothraki language, and her face was a little confused. She had heard such a name since she just landed. "This, Khal the Dragon refers to Viserys, right? I heard that Khal is their name for king." Rhaenys asked with a little confusion on her pretty face. "They call me Khaleesi of Khal the Dragon? What does Khaleesi mean?" Rhaenys had heard that the title of Khal represented the king of the Dothraki, but she really didn't understand what Khaleesi meant. The soldier who knew Dothraki did not hesitate when he heard the princess question. He was a bit outspoken and spoke directly before Viserys could stop him. "Your Highness, in Dothraki, Khaleesi means the woman of the cow, which is what we call the queen." The translator spoke directly, and Viserys was about to raise his hand to stop him, but was a step too late. He could only scratch his head. "What?" When Rhaenys heard the translator's explanation, her beautiful eyes widened immediately. The brown-haired girl obviously did not expect this to be the meaning, and then her face turned slightly red. "Don't they know me?" Viserys also shook his head slightly when he saw this. Then he pondered for a moment, then looked up at the translator. Why would the Dothraki do this and suddenly express their submission? Viserys was a little confused about the Dothraki's brain circuit. They were obviously mortal enemies. Rhaenys just burned two of their cows to death with a breath of dragon flame. Shouldn't they fight hard to avenge their cows? Moreover, when Viserys defeated Drogo, he also captured many Dothraki. At that time, based on his understanding of the plot in his previous life, Viserys was extremely envious of these natural cavalrymen who were skilled in riding. Unfortunately, the Dothraki would rather be sold as slaves than to surrender to Viserys, a foreigner. At that time, Viserys was a little depressed. However, he did not expect that at this time. Viserys had no idea of conquering the Dothraki in advance, and these Dothraki just knelt down and surrendered. What are these people thinking? Viserys was a little confused, and then asked. Although the soldier who knew Dothraki could understand their language, he was not a Dothraki, but he had followed the caravan, and knew a little about them. He thought for a while, and then explained. The Dothraki have no loyalty to their cows. When a cow dies in battle, they will join the tribe that defeated them. Except for the blood guards, the rest of the Dothraki had no loyalty to the cows, and then paused. Perhaps it was because your majesty defeated them on a dragon that they surrendered. The Dothraki have always believed that the Khal must ride the most majestic warhorse. The Khal is the most powerful warrior in the tribe, so he naturally has the right to ride the strongest warhorse in the tribe. The warhorse that Khal Drogo rode back then was a warhorse of extremely noble blood. It was taller than other warhorses and was extremely ferocious. It would even bite the opponent's horse during a battle. Often after a battle, the opponent's horse would be bitten and bleeding. Unfortunately, Khal Drogo's horse and he were burned to ashes by the flames. The soldier who knew Dothraki continued to explain. The Dothraki believe that the strong ride on horses, and your majesty defeated them by riding a dragon. A dragon is much stronger than the most majestic warhorse. This naturally makes it the most powerful Khal in their eyes. That's why they call you the Khal who rides the dragon and the Khal of the true dragon. The translator's explanation of the Dothraki's intentions was reasonable. In fact, the Dothraki's ideas were slightly different from what he said, but the overall difference was not far. Viserys rode a dragon to win the submission of the Dothraki. Whether for the sake of survival or other reasons, they were willing to kneel down and surrender, and even become a member of the Khal of the dragon riding Khal. Fear the strong and bully the weak. Viserys listened to the translator's explanation and raised his eyebrows slightly. Isn't this attitude of the Dothraki expressed by these 4 words? This reminded Viserys of a country in his previous life, which was willing to be a dog of the other party after being conquered by unstoppable weapons. However, Viserys was not in a hurry to accept the surrender of these Dothraki. After all, they had just defeated these Dothraki, and a number of Dothraki participating in this battle, including the captured vassal army, reached 30,000 to 40,000. Excluding the refugees whose homes were destroyed and sent back home, there were 20,000 Dothraki alone, and many of them died in the siege some time ago and just now. Now the Targaryen army has only 20,000 people, and the number of Dothraki who surrendered after the war is almost equal to this number. Viserys did not have the courage to subdue these Dothraki at this time. Otherwise, if the other party seized the opportunity to suddenly launch a mutiny, the Targaryen army would be caught off guard and would not be able to suppress them, and the result of this battle would be that all the previous efforts would be wasted. Let's talk about this later. First, confiscate the weapons of these Dothraki and detain them. Viserys thought for a moment, then waved his hand and gave the order. Understood. The officer standing nearby heard the order and hurriedly reported to their legion commander. The translator who knew Dothraki was kept by Viserys. You stay. Viserys raised his finger and pointed, and the soldier hurriedly nodded and followed the king. Viserys still had some questions to ask these surrendered Dothraki, especially the leaders of these Dothraki. Khals are dead. Find out if there are any of his bloodridders alive. He knew what kind of relationship the Horse King had with his bloodridders. They ate and slept together, and even shared their wives. Once a Khal died, his bloodridders must do their best to avenge him, and finally commit suicide, to follow their own Khal after the revenge was completed. Such unstable factors must be found out in advance, otherwise Viserys would not dare to accept these Dothraki. Chapter 275 Future Choices. As for the rest, Viserys said as he walked forward, his feet treading on the charred ground. The armor on his body made a sound, and then he stopped and thought for a moment, then turned his head and spoke. Find me 2 more caskets. I have something to ask them. Understood, your majesty. The soldier beside him nodded and agreed. Yes. Viserys nodded slightly, and the soldier ran away. Then the young king in bright silver armor stood there and looked at the battlefield that was gradually becoming quiet. The setting sun above his head sprinkled on this land, and the soldiers were cleaning up here, taking away the Dothraki who knelt down and surrendered one by one. Viserys certainly did not forget that the war here was over, and there were still as many as 50,000 Dothraki main forces in Pentos who were besieging the mighty city. After the war here was over, he would lead these people to encircle Pentos without stopping. The enemy was completely annihilated on the battlefield of Hellfire, and now the Dothraki's retreat has been cut off by the Targaryen army. All that was left was to close a net. At this time, a Dothraki who pretended to surrender suddenly jumped up when he passed by, trying to kill Viserys. Then he dodged it easily, as if he had eyes in the back, and then twisted the other's neck, and the body fell to the ground. All the Dothraki who knelt and surrendered were immediately terrified, and their eyes looked at Viserys more fanatically. However, Viserys acted very calmly, just lowered his head to look at the corpse on the ground, and then left here, just like pinching a small ant to death. Such a sneak attack is too crude to hurt him now, and it is too much worse than the faceless men in the past. He doesn't even need to bring his personal guards now, because the personal guards can't protect him, and even Viserys needs to help them. Now even if the faceless men attack him again, they can't assassinate him successfully. The death of 2 faceless men last time was a warning to the House of Black and White. The faceless organization has never suffered such a heavy blow. One target lost 2 members, although one of them was only a peripheral member and there was only one core member. They didn't know what happened. However, the opponent's strength was indeed unfathomable and capable of killing the faceless, which was enough to make the faceless organization alert. They had already executed the Order of the Sea King. Next, even the Sea King could not ask them to continue to attack Viserys. It was really not an easy thing to mobilize them. And they would also carefully consider the tasks of the Targaryen family. If they completely angered the other party, there would be a great possibility of a catastrophe in the future. The Black and White House had some foresight. Then, Viserys returned to the castle. The overall color of the Castle of Sol is very deep, the walls are hard, and the overall atmosphere is very solemn and heavy from a distance, which is in line with the reason for the construction of this castle. But unfortunately, the castle has not been successfully repaired. Now it is only about 1/3 of the expected completion. It can become an indestructible castle when the construction is completed. Viserys sat in the hall, and the identity of the Dothraki who suddenly attacked him just now was also found out. He was one of the blood ridders of Khal Zico. He had just led the army to attack, so he was spared from being burned to death by Rhaegal's dragon flame, but then he lost his life. But this was just a small episode on the battlefield. There were many people who wanted to kill Viserys. Then, one of the 2 surrendered Dothraki, Casco, was brought up and knelt down in fear. It looked like he regarded Viserys as a god who could not be offended. Viserys asked them a few questions about the 3 Khals who besieged Pentos on the other side, and a series of other specific information. Some interesting things were learned. However, the Cascus did not know much information. Although they were small leaders among the Khals, they only needed to execute the Khals' orders on weekdays. They rarely thought about problems independently. Only after the Khal died would they be more active and think about whether they should fight for it. Therefore, they could not provide Viserys with much information. Seeing this situation, Viserys thought for a while, then waved his hand to send them away. At this time, another Targaryen soldier hurried up from outside the door and spoke, waking up Viserys, who was thinking. "Your Majesty." He brought some special news. After hearing this, Viserys was slightly stunned, a little surprised. It turned out that there were hundreds of Bravosi among the captured prisoners. Some of them were craftsmen who helped the Dothraki to build siege weapons, and the other part were soldiers responsible for operating these weapons. But unfortunately, neither Khal Jiko nor Khal Moro could use the weapons made with the help of the Bravosi. Rhaegal burned them to death with a breath of dragon flame, and even the giant crossbow was burned a lot. Classic was wiped out without firing a shot. The soldiers came to ask Viserys what to do with these people, and Viserys thought for a while. Craftsmen who build siege weapons. This is a good thing, and it would be in vain if he killed them with a knife. Then he waved his hand and took everything. If Bravosi still had any face, it would not come to ask for it, and there was a reason for him to come to ask for it. These were his prisoners of war. As for whether they would turn against each other or not, Viserys no longer cared, because he had just taken advantage of the night a few days ago to ride on a dragon and burn the pirates who blocked the Bay of Pentos. More than a dozen pirate ships were burned and sank to the bottom of the sea, and many were damaged and needed repairs. It is very likely that they will sink if they cannot return to Pentos. And the next morning, the soldiers on the watchtower found that all the pirate ships that blocked the sea had disappeared. The flow of ships to the outside of Pentos has returned to normal, and the supply of materials will soon be improved. After the battle, all the surrendered Dothraki were confiscated and imprisoned. And that night, Viserys was also thinking about the situation on the continent of Essos after the end of this war. The Dothraki were frustrated in their westward advance, and there was no foreign thing to plunder. In the future, the disputes on the grassland will inevitably become more intense. And here in the free trade city, Targaryen must have stood in a position that cannot be ignored. Pentos has great potential, with a very developed population and economy, and it has the powerful military protection of the Targaryen. Next is the moment when Pentos, the engine, drives the entire chariot forward. Do you want to turn against Bravos now? Challenge the position of the leader of the free trade cities? Or continue to wait for the situation at the wall and seize the opportunity to invade Westeros when necessary? Viserys was a little hesitant. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.